Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 305 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on May 30th, 2026. This is the official podcast for the fan site, avatarthelastairbender.online.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So on today's show, we're going to go over some of the kind of main news topics from the last kind of couple of days, couple of weeks, and then we'll be doing 3 episodes as part of our continued rewatch through Avatar and Korra. We're going to be doing from Avatar, The Beach, and also the Avatar and The Firelord, and then from Korra, we're going to be doing The Ultimatum. So we'll get into things here with the news, and we'll actually start with the biggest piece of news, which actually just happened very, very recently. Kind of coming out of nowhere, though I suppose we maybe had a sense this might have been something they were going to do, but I definitely think took a lot of people by surprise that it's happening, and it's happening as soon as it is. The Legend of Korra in concert has just been announced. They have an official website up. All the official social medias were posting about it. Brian has, Jeremy Zuckerman has posted about it. Really, really interesting stuff. So it's basically Avatar in concert, but it's for Korra, obviously. They are starting off with actually the UK and Europe, and then they said that USA dates will be announced soon. Everything about the format looks like, it's just a Korra version of the previous show. And it's cool. Like, pre-sale tickets are already on sale. I think we're already at the point now where just anyone can kind of buy the tickets. Pretty exciting stuff. I definitely think the reaction to this was really, really good. Everyone seems kind of excited about this, especially because Korra doesn't tend to get a lot of stuff. So this is kind of a nice kind of vote of confidence officially in Korra. But what are your thoughts on this? Legend of Korra in concert.
I think this is awesome. I was really happy to see this. I think, we've talked about it and people in the fandom and stuff have, thought that this would be, a pretty good potential that they would do it. It's just sort of like when they would do it, would there be any sort of lead up to it being announced? We know that they have easier access to the audio for this rather than sort of the original series that was quite a while ago. So considering there seems to be enough of sort of want for it, at least from the little bit of the music that has been released officially, this seems like a pretty good progression. I guess we'll have to see how well it does overall, but from all the impressions that I've seen online, people have been pretty excited for it and just waiting for as always, just more locations and more announcements to be put up to see where it's going to be when it goes to next and stuff like that. But no, I think this is really cool. I'm definitely gonna check it out when it hopefully comes near me.
Yeah, that remains the only negative. Anything about the concerts is just they're not doing one near me. Like, I never got to see Avatar in concert because they never came to Ireland.
Yeah.
This one there's no Ireland showing here, and then the same for especially people in regions of the world where they just haven't done one anywhere nearby. It's particularly kind of rough. Yeah. But the idea is that this realistically confirms something we kind of knew about from before, which is probably that the Legend of Korra soundtracks are probably going to get released at some point soon as well. That has yet to be directly confirmed, attached to this announcement, but back when we first heard about the Avatar soundtracks happening, Jeremy Zuckerman did say that the plan was for Korra to get it. And I think the fact that they're doing maybe the bigger, the riskier thing, the concert tour first, pretty much to me confirms they're going to do the Korra soundtrack releases, which is really cool as well. We'll see how they go about this in terms of as you were kind of alluding to, is it all just kind of good to go? Will they be re-recording any of this or not? We'll see, because they already did a release of the Book 1 soundtrack, so they felt it was good enough back then, so that should lead to it being kind of a little bit more efficient here. But there's still some stuff we have to get through. Obviously, the Book 3 soundtrack has been continued to be teased. I'm assuming that will be released in or around San Diego Comic-Con. So literally weeks probably away from that happening. Then, of course, by the time we get to October, November for the movie, the Aang movie soundtrack is probably going to release. Whenever Seven Havens drops, we'd expect that soundtrack to release. So it's just, I suppose, them finding the right slot to actually put this out and not having like a million Avatar soundtracks out at the like exact same time. But what are your thoughts on that? What do you think this means for Korra soundtracks happening?
Yeah, no, I would suspect that it would come pretty soon once the concert starts rolling, and hopefully they see, a renewed, maybe general, just sort of interest in it. Because yeah, I mean, you would think that the live concert would be sort of the more risky thing because it has to get people physically there.
Mm.
So I guess I would, sort of go along with the idea that this showing the strength of the concert in places would lead to them hopefully, thinking that sales for the soundtracks could, match up to hopefully their expectations. We know that their expectations for soundtracks seem to be a bit sort of skewed sometimes, at least from, our sort of normal people views of things. So we'll have to see how that goes overall.
Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, just in terms of like the dates on this stuff, the first kind of performance is January 31st, and then this goes all the way up to March 23rd is the kind of furthest into the future date. So I'm assuming they're probably going to have like, I guess, summer dates probably for USA or just before summer, but we'll see that when we kind of get to it here. But still, yeah, the usual details are here. It's, I think, just about 2 hours long. There will be an intermission. There's no information just yet about like merchandise or anything like that, but I'm assuming they'll just do the ATLA concert merchandise, just like Korra version probably.
Yeah.
That'll be the kind of like basics of what they do, and then we'll see where they go from here. But yeah, lots of soundtrack stuff happening is very cool. And just in general, like I think a lot of Korra fans were kind of surprised to just see like them really promote a big Korra thing, because when was the last time that really happened? Like all the focus is on the Aang movie, ATLA. A lot of the books are ATLA. There's only one Korra kind of book slash comic on the schedule, the Kaya comic. Yes, Korra is included in stuff like Realms Collide, the fighting game, the character encyclopedia, but there's only one Legend of Korra branded kind of book coming out, and it just kind of feels like, are they forgetting about it a little bit? It gives you hope that like maybe when Seven Havens comes out, they'll double down a little bit more on Korra, and Korra will get some of the stuff that kind of Avatar's getting at the moment. But what are your thoughts just on that? Like a big project for Korra. Do you think there'll be a bit of a kind of resurgence and official support behind Korra stuff kind of stemming from this?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like this would, in my mind, it would actually hope that it would do more of it. But I don't know. I feel like, they're trying to sort of, I don't know, they've always had this weird thing where, they've been trying to sort of merge things together and make it sort of, the whole Avatar Legends thing. But, they're still focusing on what makes them, primarily the most money, which, makes sense, corporate wise and everything like that. But there is a whole nother franchise that is there. And I think you're probably right with it leading into Seven Havens and stuff like that. That would feel like it's a good way to sort of key them into making more content around it. I don't know if I really think they're going to do too much more for it, because it feels like there's still a lot of other stuff that they want to do to sort of push it out there a bit more. So I don't know. I think it's still going to take a lot longer for them to really push more of the Korra stuff. And even then, I'm thinking, I would suspect that they would focus on more new projects rather than going back to the older stuff, unfortunately.
Mm. Yeah, I think for me, it's just like, say, the Jazzwares toy line. Like, okay, do a few waves of like ATLA stuff, drop some movie stuff in there, but get to Korra eventually, because I think it feels like Nickelodeon are almost forgetting that with a lot of the Avatar stuff, we're seeing our third, fourth, fifth attempt at like a toy line or this style of book, whereas like with Korra, it'd be like your first time doing a lot of like mass release merchandise, or the first time we're really getting like a Korra data book style thing, if they ever do that. But yeah, this is cool, and especially when we get around to the book 2, 3, and 4 soundtracks, which never actually released, it'll be especially exciting when we get there. The only real news about like proper Avatar Studios stuff is just that I suppose there's one tiny bit of news and then one bigger news. Is just they have started to put up some placeholder images on some of the Aang movie books. Now it's just the logo and kind of titling stuff, but it's more than we've had before. We now have the logo in a few different colors, which is sort of interesting. But the bigger piece of news is that they have announced a new one here, a new book, Avatar Aang, The Last Airbender, The Art of the Movie, and The Art of the Movie Deluxe Edition. So straight away, the interesting point here is the art book is being done by Abrams Books, not Dark Horse Comics. And the release date for both editions is the 10th of November 2026. So that is a last couple of weeks new date. We've never heard about anything before. So the assumption would be that I guess the release of the movie is before November 10th. It's hard to judge exactly how close it's going to be, but a decent sign that this is what's happening here. So yeah, 10th of November, 256 pages is the kind of page count here. The description is what you'd expect from an art book. They mentioned that there's, insights from Mike, Brian, director Lauren Montgomery, and so on. The details about the deluxe edition, interestingly, are kind of hidden in most of the listings. So if you aren't on the Edelweiss listing, you have no idea what the deluxe edition actually is. But what it does say in key selling points about what's special about the deluxe edition, which is twice the price of the normal edition, is that there are 10 vellum tracing sheets placed in front of chapter openers to layer landscape images and emulate animation cells. Layered together, you see the final art. Separately, you see the work in progress. All enclosed in a premium presentation cloth slipcase box with foil stamping. So they're actually doing something, giving you something deluxe that kind of gives you the kind of animation effect, which I think a lot of people are actually quite excited about compared to other deluxe editions where it's like, ooh, where's my ribbon bookmark and stuff like that. This actually seems somewhat interesting. But what are your thoughts on this? Changing publishers here for the art book and it being released so soon, I suppose, after the movie.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of it. I think, I'm gonna assume that, unless the movie doesn't do well or something like that, it's probably gonna be pretty good, and people be pretty interested in it. I mean, I don't know, from the description, it sounds cool. I'm still, I would like to see the cover, of course, but I'm sure that'll be spoilers for the movie, so of course they're not gonna show that ahead of time. The deluxe one definitely, it actually does sound pretty interesting. I think I'm on, the wavelength of, several other people where the idea of having cells in the book, even though, that's not how they actually make the animation anymore, does sound pretty cool. And it sounds like it's something more unique. Like I was expecting something more like, like the pull-out posters that they usually do or something like that. And you mentioned the bookmarks, they've done that in other places. So I don't know. I think this is something different. Is it worth, the another $50 for it? I'm not quite sure. I think I would definitely have to see a preview of that to see if it was really worth it for me to get that one. But just the idea of it in general, I think is pretty cool. And, I think anything that sort of adds more to the movie, I think, for fans of it will be, very interested in it.
Yeah, like I do think this is going to do well, even with the kind of $100 price point for the deluxe edition, just because this and the movie novelization, which has extra content, are going to be like the two, I suppose, standout publishing releases attached to the movie. So
yeah,
I think people are just going to grab those two, and especially if people still have issues with like Paramount, these two books might be the main way to like support the movie type thing. So yeah, this is kind of pretty cool. Makes you wonder, like, oh, did something happen with Dark Horse where like they're not doing the art books over there? It's hard to know exactly what the situation is there, but yeah, that's where we're at there. The other book that got the kind of placeholder image was the Abrams calendar, which we'd known about from before, but it got delisted because it had the old title, and it's now kind of back up. That one has a 13th of October release date. So they're committing to doing the calendar. The problem still remains, I think, just that like there's no proper imagery attached to any of this stuff, and we're still a little bit confused as to like what's going on with kind of communication. I do think a lot of the leaks surrounding the movie have mostly calmed like super heavily down. You still see them, but they're really not as prevalent as they once were. Um, it looks like at this point they're waiting for San Diego Comic-Con to kickstart the marketing campaign. It's just they're really placing a lot of importance on San Diego Comic-Con at this point, and I wonder how they're going to handle this, because it's basically going to be like the first time in what, like 7 months since the last like official communication. You can say it's been the first time in like a year since this kind of convention style communication. There's a lot of pressure to deliver there, but where are you at this point in time? We're still the core of like what, 2 months away from San Diego Comic Con. Do you think it's still the focus for what they're planning to do?
Yeah, I can't see it not being the focus for what they're planning to do. I mean, that seems like a good launch point for things and to just sort of get it out there. Even if they do sort of the thing where they, start announcing it like a little bit before San Diego Comic Con, I still feel like the bulk of it will be there. I'm curious to see how focused they do it. If it's like, they're doing one where it's everything together in a panel like they've done in the past, or if they have one that's sort of like solely focused on just sort of the new stuff, the movie and stuff like that. So I don't know. It'll be telling in terms of how they sort of set up their panels and stuff, how it's going to actually go out there. Like, do they have any sort of like additional experiences like they had, most recently? So I don't know. I think there's a lot of different ways that they can go about it. But yeah, I at this point, I can't see, unless they just do something on their own ahead of time just to, be different or whatever. I can't see it, going past that in terms of like announcing it, assuming it's still, everything's good with it and whatnot.
Yeah, it's still just a weird situation that like everyone knows stuff about the movie basically, but we might be waiting for like convention coverage to actually like hear about this stuff for like officially the first time. That's kind of weird. So yeah, it feels like they probably still need to do something beforehand, just so it's literally not like some of the very first things outside of the title and logo that we're hearing about officially. Um, but yeah, there needs to be a full like Avatar Studios thing here. They just communication across the board needs to be pretty strong here. Like publishing panel, there's publishing stuff to be announced, merch stuff absolutely needs to be announced. But then there's weirdness with that as well, where like because of how weird the communication has been, regardless of the leak or not, they're being weird about information on the movie. Like if they do this kind of out of order, the publishing panel might not be allowed to talk about the Ang movie books because of the timing, and merch stuff. They might not be able to show stuff if the timing isn't right, and that that becomes a bit of a weird thing. And it's almost like, in a way, because of the leak, can't you just kind of show it off, even if maybe this wasn't initially part of the plans? Just like be a little bit more kind of open about this, just because my assumption is that like a lot of the stuff that you'd probably see on the cover of these books wouldn't really be spoilery. It's just going to be like group shots of the characters, and like we've already sort of officially had them released via the t-shirt kind of images and stuff like that. So there's some weirdness there, where like I don't really know how much they would actually spoil. So yeah, it's an awkward situation. I'm fascinated to see how they handle this
Yeah.
disaster kind of situation, and do they address the leak? How strongly do they address the leak? I assume the most they'll probably do is make a bit of a joke about it, that like, hey, you guys
Yeah,
know this
exactly.
stuff, and kind of move on from there. But yeah, just I suppose, yeah, just final thoughts there on just like, how do you think going forward they'll handle just the weird situation we find ourselves in?
Yeah, no, I 100% expect like a off comment joke by, Brian or Mike, during whatever they're doing when they're, sort of announcing things, depending on how they, do the panels and stuff like that. Like that. We've seen them do that before. So like, I don't think anyone who's been to the panels or who's, followed them in any, a little bit more of a detail would be surprised by that. But beyond that, I would expect very little in any sort of like official capacity. Just because that's just not how, they talk about stuff and whatnot. So I almost would be surprised if they even do sort of like a live Q&A like they've done in the past for some of the things, just because of all of the noise around it and stuff like that. As far as them sort of like putting up more, media because of the leaks, I don't feel like that's in the corporate sense. I don't feel like that's a good enough reason for them to show a little bit more of it, unless they were already planning on showing it. Like if they say they do like a teaser trailer or something at Comic Con or something like that, then I would expect some of the sort of publishing things to sort of show off their covers, even if we don't understand who the villain is or anything like that. For people who aren't already cued in on things, then it wouldn't really matter because they've already showed it in some sort of format ahead of time. But if they don't do something like that, I know it would be like very not cool to see like a coming soon cover at the panel. Like that's never really fun. Usually it's fun to hear about the book, but you sort of want a little bit more if you can have it. So I guess it depends on how open the panels are. Like I don't know, maybe if the panels are more closed off, like they don't do the live stream, then they might show a little bit more there. Not that the news wouldn't get out regardless, but then it wouldn't be as sort of out there as it would be, otherwise. So I don't know. It really will be very sort of fascinating to see how things play out.
Yeah, and then like Seven Havens, at the convention, it'll be like a year since they showed off the image, which remains in this funny situation where like that's the first like Avatar Studios project image, yet it's the second project, and again, because it's a movie, how odd they're being about it. So hopefully they do more on that, but we'll see what happens. The thing that's immediately, I suppose, coming up like next that's going to be kind of big is Netflix Avatar Season 2. So they properly kicked the kind of marketing off in a big way with the proper trailer, the full trailer for Season 2, which is coming June 25th. So we're not too far away from the release of this. But yeah, just under 2 minutes long here. We got our big look. They kind of revealed Bossing Say here. It From what I saw, the reaction was, I think, pretty good. There's definitely excitement around this, but it doesn't feel like it's the same as season 1. I think some of the novelty around the series has kind of worn off a little bit, and people are more concerned about just the adaptation. How are they doing this? What order are they doing? What's being cut? Those are kind of the questions that I think a lot of people have, and the trailer at the very least brings up one or two kind of interesting points about like, what are they doing here? But otherwise looks about the same as kind of season 1, where at least for me, it looks relatively good. I'm being careful, I suppose, not to be overhyped by it, because I think season 1, there was tons of hype after a lot of the trailers, but it really calmed down once we actually saw the show, and the trailers show it at the best. They don't show the kind of in between kind of bits as much. But what's your general kind of reading of the fandom after this trailer?
Yeah, I don't know. I almost would put it in sort of a mixed area, because I mean the people who are into it are still sort of into it. And it generated noise, so people definitely were talking about it. But I think, considering, and, we already knew the list of the episodes, not that we knew, what the episodes were actually going to be, exactly about or anything like that, but we had the general idea of how many episodes they were going to have and sort of a feeling, and now we have a little bit more of a picture of what's going to actually be sort of entailed in it. So I think, for some people, it definitely has sort of like maybe tapered their sort of expectations of things just a little bit, but I don't know. I think it's still, people interested in it. I mean, I think, the trailer online on YouTube has like, 1 million+ views and stuff like that. So there's still interest for it. Avatar's still a big brand, and, we've been waiting to see what they're going to do with this. And we know that the, following season is going to come up right behind it relatively soon because they already filmed it. So we know it's not going to be, as long of a wait. So no, I think, I don't know. I find this sort of like middling now. I think people are definitely, like you're saying there, they know what they're sort of into it. So people who are into it are definitely, speaking about it and are, very interested in seeing it.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where it's like with season 1, it was like almost every screenshot was kind of interesting, but like this time around, it's just like, yeah, that's Zuko in the show. I know what Zuko in this show looks like. okay. And it's just like, okay, they're not overly showing like new characters. Like they didn't actually show off, say, like Long Feng here, but they did show off like Judy. There's kind of stuff like that that's kind of interesting. Um, Oddly, the biggest talking point probably coming out of this is the fact that we're going to get Katara as the Painted Lady in season 2, fighting next to Blue Spirit Zuko. Um, Well, obviously, this brings up the typical kind of back and forth conversation that happens surrounding adaptations, which is that obviously, if you know the original, the Painted Lady is a Fire Nation river spirit. We're not in the Fire Nation, so that speaks to the idea that I suppose the origin of the Blue Spirit is getting, or not the Blue Spirit, the Painted Lady is getting changed. And then why is Katara going undercover at certain points here? They're clearly trying to add a little bit more onto, I suppose, setup, I suppose, ahead of the big Katara and Zuko have their conversation in the catacombs, is I'm guessing primarily why they're doing this, but I'm really interested to see if this will be a needed thing, or they're just kind of going for the fun factor of just the two characters with sort of like alter egos overall. But what are your thoughts on Painted Lady in season 2?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely stands out. It definitely feels like this is like, I don't know if this is like sort of the biggest sort of change we've seen so far, but it definitely feels like a very sort of like they're alternating things because of, how they have to sort of structure the story and stuff like that, which I don't know. No, I guess we'll see if it works or not. But yeah, and it's such a small part of the trailer too. Like you could easily sort of miss it if you weren't sort of paying attention to things too. So the fact that they sort of had the idea to sneak it in there, which they know people are going to notice it because everyone's sort of looking at this. I don't know, makes me think of just sort of what's their sort of end game with having this in there and having it come up so early. Like, is this actually going to matter next season, or is it just going to be something thrown to the wayside?
Yeah, one of the other kind of, I suppose, continuity talking points was obviously that Judy is in the trailer. Judy says there's no war in Bossing Say, but that's not the person who originally says it. And like the intent of the Judys is for them to not be like as overly overt with the whole there's no war in the walls type situation. That's meant to be coming from Long Feng, the Dai Li. If they arrest you for saying too much when you're being brainwashed, they say there's no war within the walls. I'm guessing they get away with it here because like Team Avatar is like VIPs, and so Judy saying it to them doesn't mean as much here. But like there's definitely some discussion happening here about like, oh, has the meme gone too far? Because the online meme of this is obviously Judy saying it when she doesn't actually say it. The Judys are kind of the early stage, like, we don't talk about this stuff, being very polite about it without kind of acknowledging it. And there's just little bits and pieces like that. So the context behind that will be kind of interesting to see in the same way as the Painted Lady stuff. But that's also where we highlight that they didn't show off Long Feng in this trailer, even though Long Feng is definitely in the show. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I mean, I think the character stuff and the way that they set it up here definitely is cool, and I think it got a lot of buzz. So from that regard, I think it was worth it for them to sort of have it there. But yeah, in terms of like how it works in the actual story here, it does sort of make you wonder because yeah, they're usually more sort of talking around sort of the issue of the war and stuff like that, rather than directly sort of confirming that it's something that they're actively sort of like avoiding. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess it probably won't be that big of a thing when they do say it to the group or anything like that, unless that's like the point in the story where they freak out about it or whatever. So yeah, I don't know. It'll be curious to see where that plays.
Mm-hmm. I suppose is there a specific point in the trailer you want to talk about here?
I mean, I think for the most part, I like most of the trailer, what we see. I mean, I think there's been a lot of noise about Azula, in certain scenes and stuff like that. So I think I'm curious to see how she plays out in the season, just because, she's such a fan favorite character that, getting to see her in live action format, I think is something that, going to either work for people or is really not going to work for them. But I think, for the most part, all the other characters, other than, specific key points of their characters and stuff like that, which I know some people are hoping they sort of alter story wise in the written part, most people are pretty happy with what they're doing. I mean, I think the only other thing people are sort of, knocking on is just sort of Aang being older, but there's, not much you can really do about that considering it's a live action show.
Yeah. Yeah, the over focus on that feels weird because it's like you watched season one, like this was built into it by default that like the timing on things is going to be different. This is why they still don't know exactly when the comet is coming, and all that sort of stuff. Like there's going to be a time skip built into the very start of what's going on here. It's not they're not just going to like treat it as like, oh, this is only like a few weeks later and Aang's like 2 foot taller or something like that. Because you can see in the trailer, like one of the other points that this is something that was obviously heavily criticized with season one. Aang didn't do any waterbending training, yet he clearly can waterbend now because we see a pretty comedic scene of him just like sending a Fire Nation soldier to the moon or something like that. The the effect there compared to like the attack he's hit with doesn't really maybe match up so much, but it's like, okay, he can do waterbending. That's interesting because he was thought it during the time skip, obviously. So I guess we'll get maybe a montage or something like that. See what happens, because it's funny that like they just ignored that basically in season one, yet they almost like spoil that he learns earthbending this season in the trailer. But that's kind of interesting. Anything else for me? You can get a little bit of a sense for like I suppose the structure a bit more about what exactly they're doing, where you see that the whole whatever way they're doing the chase here is going to work a little bit differently, and this is what's going to lead at the very least like Iroh and Zuko into bossing Say, because you can see injured Iroh from the chase on the boat, yeah. Zuko with Jet, they're going to bossing Say. Obviously I guess on the Aang side of things, this is probably where they part ways with Suki. So the Serpent's Pass again is happening quite early on, but the chase is kind of connected into that. So they've moved some things around a little bit, definitely. And that's another point online, I suppose, is that some people seem shocked that the show is making any changes when, like, did you see season one? Like, some of those episodes were, like, completely different than they were kind of, like, were in the original. But yeah, otherwise, yeah, it all looks fairly solid. We get double confirmation. We had one of the episode titles, but Wan Shi Tong, the library, we're doing that. The timing is obviously going to be different, so we'll see what exactly happens in that. I'm not 100% sure the library is necessarily going to be in the desert based on what we do here, but we'll see. They could be kind of holding back some of that stuff. Similarly, I think there's been a decent amount of discussion about, like, okay, Appa's clearly getting taken, but again, is it happening in the exact same way as in the original? What's the timing? It might be more just that he gets taken in Bossing Say rather than anything else. But yeah, what are your thoughts on some of these kind of adaptation things that we have here? What from this trailer, what do you think is maybe being cut, left out, and what's getting more focused on?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I like the idea that, we have Chet in the mix and things, but I feel like, it seems like we have a good bit of him in the trailer, but I'm always, trailers are always a bit sort of misleading in terms of like how much of an importance that actually is. I would suspect that sort of, a lot of Appa stuff isn't sort of as heavily focused as what it was sort of originally, especially when, Appa's sort of like on his own, doing his own thing and trying to survive and stuff like that. Like, just because of, how, VFX and budgets and stuff work, I'd be surprised if we have a lot of that stuff, despite how, interesting and cool it was in the original sort of series there. But I don't know. I think it's cool that we are at least getting, it seems like we're getting sort of like the core of what sort of the series had without a lot of the extra fluff. So I don't I'm hopeful that at least it's done in sort of like a confluent and like sort of like continuity sort of type of way, but I'm really sort of waiting to see.
Yeah, I think for me at this point, I'm pretty convinced the drill they're either not doing or they'll highlight that it maybe happened previously and like that the drill is there, but like it's not moving. Like we're not getting the full drill action sequence, um, unless they're completely hiding it somehow. It just feels like that's a crazy set piece. That's not the most plot focused kind of type thing. So, um, that's probably one of the big ones that feels like okay, I guess we're not doing that. Similarly, obviously a lot of the early book 2 stuff is clearly being skipped over or will be attempted to be incorporated in later on, in that you don't really see any Avatar state stuff. The poster that they released for season 2 has Aang in the Avatar state, but otherwise the trailer isn't massively suggesting that arc. I think there's a little bit of the kind of a catacombs kind of fight where it would happen in the trailer, but there's no particular kind of through line maybe on that necessarily. So that's that. They already did Cave of Two Lovers in season 1, which is kind of odd by itself. Omashu, we see a shot of Aang looking at Omashu off in the distance as new Ozai. So I'm convinced they're either gonna highlight that at some point in the time skip they figured out what happened with Omashu and we just jump in with them getting the refugees out, and that's how we do it rather than overly maybe focusing on the core of that episode, but we'll see how they do. Not seeing any swamp, not seeing any Avatar Day. So a lot of those more kind of character focused episodes, which are kind of the stuff that this, based on season 1, the show kind of needs. In that, like, oh yeah, you kind of realize that like certain dynamics with the characters haven't been covered at all because, you know, Katara's only character focused episode was this one. So you get her jet dynamic, but you're missing out on the dynamic that would have been presented in like Imprisoned or this one. So hopefully they bring all that stuff together pretty well. But we'll have more trailers. They're gonna heavily promote this one. My main thing is just that it looks like the timing's actually going to work out quite well for like the franchise here, because it serves as a further pretty nice distraction from all the Aang movie leaks. And then by the time things are calming down, like 2 or 3 weeks after release, we're only 2 or 3 weeks away from San Diego Comic-Con, and they can start the marketing for Avatar Studios stuff properly. So that's my kind of main thing, is just I'm glad stuff kind of seems to be working out for the most part, because season 1 did bring a kind of boost of excitement back into the fandom. I think this will do the same, even if it's not like crazy super well received. But I think that's the main thing with this, is that like it's not an embarrassing adaptation. It's good in some ways, not as good in others, but it's a solid enough adaptation where like it's useful for the franchise. But and any final thoughts on kind of pre season 2 stuff for Netflix Avatar?
No, I agree. I think it really does sort of, despite, us who are really into the animation and stuff like that, I think this has really, brought a lot more people into the fandom who have looked at, other stuff that's come out in other forms of media for Avatar. So I think, it's definitely not the worst adaptation ever.
Mm-hmm. And then there has been other bits and pieces of news. I think the main ones to highlight, maybe just some of the video game stuff. Realms Collide had a pretty interesting announcement where they revealed one of the upcoming characters that's coming out is Jetson from the Yang Chen novels is coming to the game. So again, their usual weirdness of like not really saying when the character is coming, because Rangi's been coming for like a year, still not in the game yet, but she's coming. Kelsong is coming. Now Jetson is interesting because the other characters from the novels had designs already from Avatar Generations, but this Jetson design is completely new and original, and we weren't really sure if this game was allowed to kind of do that, but they clearly can. So that's cool, even if I think most people have like, the people who are playing that game, and I'm not sure they're going to get many more people to kind of jump on board, because the way the game uses characters doesn't really like use them that much. It's like, okay, I'll log in to take a look at her kind of character bio, because you don't even have to get the character to look at that, and that will probably be about it. I just want to see what they kind of say about her, the 1 or 2 animations they have for her on that screen. That will be interesting by itself, because Yeah, this game doesn't really have too much ability to like get people up to speed with who she actually is, because the story mode is kind of non-existent. But yeah, did you have any thoughts on that? The character design for Jetson, Yang Chen's sister.
I saw that. I think it's cool that the game's able to sort of make these designs, even if it is very similar to what we've seen before. Just the idea that they're making it and adding it to the game. For those who are playing the game and stuff like that, I think this is cool. But yeah, the game itself, I don't know, it's weird. I mean, I guess it's very odd that a mobile first game seems to be the only one that pushes so much sort of content and new content out there for the franchise compared to everything else that's sort of around Avatar and stuff like that. So I don't know. This it's a weird one where I'm glad they're still doing stuff, but it's not something that I would personally be interested at all. But I guess it's the fact that they're still doing content updates means that it has enough of a user base to keep it going, which is good.
Yeah, it's weird because they've gotten through this kind of year and a bit, I suppose, after launch by mostly having a lot of characters they had in pre-release, like that were not in the launch of the game, just kind of added back in that like they promised novel characters from like months before the game even came out, and we're only, I think, in the next couple of months actually going to get like the first one of them in the game. So uh yeah, hopefully they continue, but I wish there was a bit more kind of story content, or just a bit more an event surrounding these things, because this is literally going to be the characters in the game, and you get it via the wheel thing in the game, or you get it via the whole leaderboard point thing that they do. They're like the only two ways you get the character, other than just straight up buying them. So it's literally just the character, and I'm not expecting any particular content with anything else. Even though we have the whole Realms Collide aspect, like that story wise basically is not a factor really in the story mode, which they haven't updated in a really long time. So it's an odd situation. The more interesting game is, of course, Avatar Legends, the fighting game. They did all the Azula stuff, so Azula's been revealed as a character. We know all that sort of stuff. People seem quite excited about that. But then they just recently teased that the next character we're going to get details on is Kyoshi. They put out a little bit of a kind of dev video going over Azula, but they also mentioned at the end that a fighting game streamer is going to get the review, the kind of preview reveal of Kyoshi, and they showed off like a quick 2 or 3 second kind of shot of Kyoshi on the other side of the screen in the arena from Azula, and everyone, of course, is having a crazy reaction to the height difference, of course, which is kind of interesting by itself, that like a lot of people seem quite surprised by how tall Kyoshi is, whereas I think for us that's like the obvious point about her. But yeah, this is probably for me the most exciting character, just to see like each character has 3 supports, so we're expecting, I assume, some novel references for Kyoshi's supports, because if they don't reference the novels, I'm not entirely sure who they're actually going to be, because it would be very odd if it was like, oh, Chin the Conqueror, the Earth King from that Escape from the Spirit World, and I don't know who else they kind of would do. So like if they don't have Rangi here, people are going to be a little bit annoyed, I think. But what are your thoughts on the fighting game kind of recent updates?
I'm really curious. I mean, I don't. I think I'm really just enjoying that. They have this sort of game and that it's getting a lot of buzz around it, and sort of this being at like conventions and sort of the fight sticks and the arcade machines and stuff like that. So no, I think it's really cool that at least for now it seems like people are really sort of into it and really sort of taking it as sort of like a real sort of game, especially sort of like the fighting community itself, because that can be sort of like fickle in terms of like what they're really sort of into and stuff like that. So no, I think it's really cool what we've seen so far. And yeah, I am very curious to see how Kyoshi works overall as a player, and just sort of her move set and sort of how her supports and stuff like that. Because yeah, I think, I mean, they could really do anything for the supports. Like they don't even have to be from the same era, or it doesn't even have to be a character that they've sort of interacted with as their support, as we've seen so far. But I think it would be really odd if it wasn't, someone that we sort of knew was, directly associated with Kyoshi from the books and stuff like that. But again, people who play this game and a lot of people who watch the show and stuff like that, they don't really know anything about Kyoshi from the novels. Like maybe they've seen like a couple social media stuff and then they'll be like, oh, what is this about? No, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if like 90% of the people playing this game who want to play Kyoshi know nothing at all about the novels. So from that perspective, it might not even be worth it for them to do that. But I will say from everything that I've seen about the game so far, they seem to be really good on, adding, very sort of, minor things that you wouldn't really think that they would sort of do in the game, like the whole redirecting lightning between, Zuko and Aang and stuff like that. So they definitely, they know about that sort of stuff. It's just, is it worth it for them to actually put in the game, budget wise and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think for me, because she's kind of like really the only Avatar Legends character to like justify the name. Otherwise, it's like the Aang and Korra fighting game. It's like, yeah, like she's your only other era character you have here. I think you should be kind of doing something with a little bit more with that era. The big thing they haven't touched on, and it's getting a little bit like, why are you waiting so long on this? Is they still haven't detailed the story mode like at all, basically. And we're in like a few days. We're like a month before release, so I'm hoping they do that soon, just to get across to sort of like people who aren't hardcore into fighting games, like what the single player content actually is, how big the scope of the story actually is, because the leak, of course, gives the impression it's this crazy story that actually kind of involves the Kyoshi era a little bit, and that like there's apparently meant to be a kind of villain from the Kyoshi era who is kind of involved in the story, but that's early concept stuff. We don't know if that's actually in the final game. That could be very interesting. And then, of course, they have a season pass for characters, and like we're getting close to release, so people want to see more of the Korra cast as well included here as well. That's probably the only criticism that I think we've really seen at the moment, is just like, why is this character not in the game, and just better utilizing other eras. But otherwise, yeah, I think people really like the depth that they're going into with the references with the characters, but also like mechanically how they seem to work just as a fighting game. So yeah, this one looks like it's going to be a pretty big success. It's just nailing the final few weeks of marketing here, and opening up pre-orders on the consoles, which they still haven't done yet. I think it's still only kind of proper pre-orders on Steam, so hopefully they sort that out soon. But yeah, that looks to be a pretty big success, and that's coming up pretty soon, actually. So that's the news, and we'll get into our reviews for this episode. So we're going to start off with the Avatar episode. So we're going to get straight into 305, episode 5 of book 3, Fire the Beach, because we did Saga's Master last time out. So the Beach, really interesting, really unique episode of Avatar, where we have our villain characters be in focus for basically 90% of the episode, and it's them going on a forced vacation because Ozai has sent them here, but it allows you to get into a lot of character stuff with these characters. So Zuko's having an ongoing arc of doubting everything that he's kind of done, but primarily I think this is mostly like this is the one where you finally get to see a little bit of a different side of Azula, and we get some of the depth for Ty Lee and May that we maybe haven't as much gotten in from previous episodes. So I always like this episode because it has those kind of unique elements. Like without this, I think we're missing a lot from some of these characters. And then there's only a small Aang and Co section of the episode, but it's a pretty cool first encounter with Combustion Man, and it makes for just a nice, quick, like, this is the B plot, solid B plot of the episode, and it's just that plot is continuing. Pretty nice. So we'll get into the details kind of shortly, but overall, what are your thoughts on The Beach?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think this one definitely stands out as a character-driven episode for the villains, which I think is something that you don't typically get. And of course, we know not all these characters stay villains by the end of the whole show. So there's a reason for them to actually do that, which I think is smart for them to do that. I think that definitely sort of helps when we get to see the characters that do sort of flip sides, get a better sort of like understanding for them. I think that, is worth it for them to do it and have that sort of runtime, dedicated to them, just being regular teenagers, which is something that, up to this point, we haven't really seen them do. Like they're so focused on their sort of task at hand that, is very important for the Fire Nation and just sort of the world at large. But, getting to see them sort of at least attempt to act as, regular sort of kids, is something that, you would almost sort of take for granted because they're so sort of task driven at what they're sort of doing. But yeah, I like this episode. I always remember sort of the end framing of the sort of group together, despite everything that happens later on by the end of the show.
So yeah, we'll start with the B plot just to get it out of the way because it is quite short, and that is just that Aang and Team Avatar, they're kind of hanging out in a lake, actually having a kind of relaxing time. There's talk about like Toph saying to Aang to like cover up because like he just has his arrows out in the open, but they're in a kind of pit, like they're surrounded by walls, so he's okay. But then he goes sliding down this kind of tunnel, and he is actually spotted by Fire Nation scouts who send a report. Basically, I suppose it's meant to be to the Fire Nation capital, but this report is intercepted by Combustion Man's Raven Eagle. And so he has the report and it doesn't go back to the Fire Nation. So that's kind of an important detail as well. So yeah, Combustion Man ends up coming after Team Avatar here and they have their first encounter with him. Toph basically saves the day here with her seismic sense that she immediately senses him coming. Because they are completely taken by surprise by the types of attacks that he's doing, because this is our first introduction to combustion bending. So all the explosions kind of going off as the team fires everything they have at him, but he keeps on coming. So they decide to run. And yeah, it's some pretty nice dynamic kind of bending that we kind of get here, including Aang getting a little bit of nice kind of one-on-one time, like blocking the slow motion air versus combustion bending kind of moment is very cool. And then escaping by using the kind of explosion boost with the rock armor. So there's some very clever action that happens here, but it's just the first failed attempt at Combustion Man to take out Aang and co. What are your thoughts on this side plot of the episode?
Yeah, I think this is fun. I think, it stands out just because we get introduced to this new character that has this very sort of like unique ability. And I don't know, it's very sort of, interesting to think about it now that we have a better understanding of sort of combustion bending and sort of his history and his sort of origins and just sort of the process for it. Not that we know much more about this character per se, but just sort of the idea of this ability and the fact that we now know that there's at least one other character who's had disabilities, and if you've read the book, there's a whole more bit about that. So I don't know, it's definitely cool to see our characters sort of interact with this ability and how they're able to handle it on such a sort of short notice here. Like they're using all their skills and technique, and because they're not really aware of what's happening in any sort of direct sense, they're just sort of reacting to it in sort of real time here. But they are able to sort of get away here, and you get to see Aang use sort of like a lot of different sort of techniques and abilities, like him always going through sort of the rock at the end with full force, with the expression on his face always sort of, sticks in my mind from this episode itself. So no, I think it's a good solid B plot, even though it is very sort of short. Like looking back on it, it seemed like it was more involved than it really was, but it really is a really small part of the episode overall.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, we'll move on to the kind of main plot here. So yeah, the Fire Nation teens, so Zuko, Mei, Ty Lee, and Azula are kind of forced to go on this vacation to Ember Island. Azula kind of, I suppose, basically says Ozai wants to meet with his advisors on his own, so he sent all them away. So they get this kind of break before the proper action of everything really goes down for the rest of the season. We do immediately get some interesting details here, which is that Ember Island, Azula and Zuko have both been here before many times, but it was when they were very young kids, and Zuko especially notes that this was a long time ago. Now, interestingly, from I suppose content that we've got since this, I guess the implication here is that this stopped once, especially like Azula was revealed to be a firebender. That seems to be the big kind of turning point in the family dynamic, where once Ozai saw that, oh, both of them are firebenders, Azula is the talented one, that's realistically when things actually stopped here. But what are your thoughts on this, just as the kind of the setup for the episode? Just out of nowhere, vacation time with the Fire Nation teens.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit out of nowhere, but we know that there's a lot of sort of like, business, I guess, political stuff going on in the background. So, the kids who, they don't want them to be involved with are sort of sent away for this sort of side excursion on the island that they have been to before. So I don't know. I think it's cool that this island has a lot of history and that, even other characters, have sort of experienced this island in one way or another. So I don't know. I think it's a sort of like a unique way that has some relevance to sort of like the history of things, being brought back into the fold. So I like that there's, a lot more going on to it than you sort of, I guess, would initially sort of think.
Lo and Lee kind of are the ones kind of like hosting them here on the island, and they kind of reveal that this island has special properties to a certain degree, that like you come here and the island will help you smooth out your ragged edges and you'll come out of this a smoother person basically in the end. And they all of course seem to sort of scoff at this idea, but it actually ends up like happening like 100%. It does kind of draw this sort of effect out of you. So that's a cool setup. But we immediately then, everyone heads out to the beach and we get the core dynamics that come out in this episode, which is one, no one recognizes Zuko or Azula as being the prince and princess. So they kind of, Azula primarily wants to lean into that and not immediately be recognized as the princess and see how that goes. Two, you see that Azula is used to being kind of the center of attention and is kind of surprised when Ty Lee is actually the more popular member of the group. May actually is more popular than her or Zuko, and you straight away have this immediate switch where like Azula and Zuko are sort of the quote unquote like losers from all the kind of like Fire Nation teen characters, and our secondary cast members stand out as more normal. And we start to kind of go from here with this dynamic where Zuko's just incredibly angry, frustrated this whole episode, so people aren't inclined towards liking him here. And then the big point of the episode is that Azula is completely kind of like fish out of water in this situation. Like she does not have any kind of, I suppose, normal social skills when she's not trying to manipulate people. And that's like probably the most fascinating dynamic in the whole episode, as you see that she's good with people in some ways, but in trying to just be normal is really, really bad. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the dynamics once we get out to the beach?
Yeah, no, I like that part of it. That is almost exactly a 180, of their positions and their roles here. We get to see how, just because they were sort of brought up in sort of royalty and sort of high society of the Fire Nation doesn't necessarily mean they can interact with people on sort of like a commoner sort of level here. And all of them, here are from high society. Like, they've all been to the Royal Fire Nation Academy and stuff like that. So like, none of them are sort of like, peasants or commoners in any sense of that regard. But in terms of interacting with more people, I mean, we know Ty Lee, she went to the circus, and that's a whole different experience from sort of their typical sort of background and stuff like that, right? So it's almost not too surprising that they would be a little bit awkward. And Zuko's sometimes a little bit better because he has been, forced to experience sort of the real world and stuff like that, but he has a whole bunch of, personal issues that are going on that's sort of hampering his ability to sort of even attempt to interact with anybody on any sort of normal level here. So yeah, I mean, it's not super surprising here, but it's just fun to get to see it sort of played out here and see how, Azula's taking a chance here to not sort of just like come at it from like the position of power that she normally would. So no, I really like that sort of switch in dynamic here.
Yeah, one of the other things we kind of highlight here is that like Zuko is trying to do some kind of like romantic gestures with May, but like they're not quite working. Like he's a little bit clumsy with it, and then May, because she tends to be kind of not particularly plussed by a lot of things, isn't particularly affected by this stuff, and it begins to sort of create this dynamic where he gets quite protective over May, overprotective here when she starts to interact with like other characters, and so this adds to Zuko's building kind of frustration, which is on top of the whole idea of like he's living a lie at the moment. Basically, that's the big thing in all of this, that as we'll get to at the end of the episode. Basically, we then immediately get into one of the more memorable moments of the episode, which is that the team kind of come together to play some Kwai ball, basically Avatar beach volleyball, and they absolutely demolish their opponents, with Azula showing her kind of military tactics here in taking out the enemy team. The team are noticed then by the kind of like cool guys on the beach, Ranjan and Chan. And interestingly here, this is where we get the dynamic of Azula wanting to kind of blend in with the other teens. Ty Lee and May get invited to the party, not Azula and Zuko. But they end up talking, and eventually everyone does get invited. But the point is, the teens recognize Ty Lee and May as people they want there, not our royal characters. And so that's the core of the dynamic here. But yeah, what are your thoughts on some of these other moments on the beach?
Yeah, no, I think, the game and stuff like that is always sort of the fun highlight of this episode, and just sort of, getting to see that, yeah, they're, just because they're royalty, you would think that they would be by default the cool people, but they don't actually have that sort of, regular person sort of appearance or appeal to them from their sort of personality. So at least not so far. So no, I thought that's, definitely something of a dynamic that they're having to sort of like adjust to on the fly here.
Then we get to the party. They arrive way too early. He said from dawn till dusk, so they arrive at dawn, and okay, they go in, and yeah, what you see straight away here is that Azula actually likes Chan and would like to potentially start some sort of relationship here, but doesn't have a clue how to actually interact normally to try and pursue a romantic relationship, and just says a bunch of military stuff that kind of weirds him out. That happens there. Zuko then begins to get a bit jealous of Ranjan, who is talking to May, and just gets a bit overly kind of physical, intense about this situation, and this continues to build and build. Ty Lee, of course, has the dynamic here where everyone is drawn to Ty Lee. She's the most like popular character here, and she has to kind of knock out with her chi blocking a bunch of boys because they kind of surround her a little bit. And then this leads to, again, I think probably one of the most interesting character moments of the episode, which is Azula kind of then insults Ty Lee about like her perception of, I suppose, how she interacts with these boys, and says they don't actually care about you. Ty Lee starts to cry, but this is where Azula reveals she only said that because she's actually jealous of how popular Ty Lee is with the boys. And so this is a shocking moment for Ty Lee, because in her mind, Azula is this like amazing, perfect character. So the idea that she's better than Azula at something is kind of crazy. So we get the sort of like, here's flirting lessons that Azula gets from Ty Lee, and she immediately puts them to use with Chan. And again, this works. It's just that, again, when the kiss happens, she takes it too far and scares him off. And that's like, at least initially in the episode, our kind of like Azula arc, where again, we see all these aspects of her we've like never seen elsewhere in the series, like her doubting herself, being jealous over, I suppose, relatively like petty things, not just using May and Ty Lee for kind of skills and stuff like that. It's very interesting to see this other side of Azula. But what are your thoughts on this kind of like arc here that we go through across these couple of scenes?
Yeah, you would never think that Azula would necessarily have these sort of insecurities, but we can see here that, her life has been sort of rather sheltered in a way, at least in terms of acting with people on sort of like a day to day or, directly one to one, without them knowing sort of the power that she holds here. So, getting to see her, actually getting advice from Ty Lee on what to do and her at least attempt to try to, use those in this sort of situation here is definitely sort of a fun bit. And, they play it up for laughs a little bit here. But I think, eventually you get to see sort of Azula's sort of like core personality assert herself. And that sort of is a bit too much for, any normal person to sort of hand on to. So I don't know. I really like that sort of, arc that she has here of like, attempting to be a normal teen and then just immediately going off the deep end.
And then there's also then the kind of like deeper analysis of this, which is obviously that because of the way she was focused on and raised by Ozai, this is
Hmm.
why she doesn't have any of these skills. Zuko's like a little bit better, a little bit more like a normal teen because he wasn't as impacted by Ozai, but still, it seems like just being in that Fire Nation royal family dynamic creates a bit of this
Yeah.
situation where like both of them, Azula and Zuko, are both not great around most people. So that's the interesting aspect that we'll get into a little bit more as we kind of go forward. Zuko kind of then gets kind of very physical with Ron. This leads to a breakup with May when they just start screaming at each other. Basically, about the idea of May is upset at Zuko for being kind of too intense about everything, and Zuko is frustrated at her for not showing any emotion over anything. And so they kind of break things off at this point. Zuko kind of storms off, goes to the beach house where they used to go, remembering kind of better times when, I suppose before the bending came into play, before the whole next in line kind of became like an important thing, including a family portrait that includes, of course, Ursa on it. And it's very interesting to kind of see this because it's a reminder of the times before things were, and he's living this kind of lie currently where, as he'll reveal later on, like Ozai thinks he's a hero, but he knows he's not, and he actually has a lot of shame over some of the things he did recently. So Zuko's in a really interesting spot kind of here. But what are your thoughts here as pretty much everyone kind of leaves the party at this point?
Yeah. Zuko's in a very sort of odd headspace to be in here because, he knows the truth of things. He's already sort of sent someone on a mission to sort of correct the truth of things, but he's doubting himself and being, back at this island and seeing, his home for the summer. He's very sort of, I guess you could say, reflective and contemplative of sort of, what things really sort of mean to him and what it means, going forward here. And, it definitely is causing a lot of sort of strife within him internally that, of course, we're getting to see here sort of, physically sort of manifested when he's sort of arguing with the host of the party and arguing with Mai and everything. So yeah, there's a lot going on here that he has to sort of work out here. And even by the end of things, he doesn't necessarily get a complete hold on it, but at least he's eventually able to sort of verbalize things.
Azula comes to kind of join Zuko at the house and basically says, "Hey, come down to the beach," where it's revealed that May and Ty Lee are also down there as well. They start a fire with notably Zuko burning the family portrait and stuff that he was just looking at in the house here. Kind of almost feels like overcompensating for like, no, I don't actually want things to go back to that point in a way, trying to convince himself. Ty Lee is quite concerned about this, kind of clearly aware that he's kind of going through all of this, but he kind of turns things around on her. He eventually calls her a circus freak. And so this is where we start to get into this idea of like the group kind of turns on each other and we get these kind of big kind of character moments here. So what is the whole situation with Ty Lee? Why was she in the circus? Well, it's because she has six sisters, six identical sisters. And this is why she left to join the circus, was because it was trying to find anything to come across as an individual among that set. She didn't want to be part of a matched set, so she joined the circus to come across as unique, of course. May comes in and talks about, oh, this is why you have like attention issues and want all these kind of boys around you because you didn't have it when you were younger with so many different sisters. So it's quite like scathing at times, like the things that they say to each other here. There's some barbs on some of the things that they say here. But this is the start of it here. So what are your thoughts on the kind of Ty Lee focus at the start of this dynamic here?
Yeah, I thought this was cool. I mean, I think, we didn't really know, as much about her. We knew that she was from the circus, of course, but we didn't really have as much of a understanding about her. And, a lot of times she seems so sort of like bubbly and happy, despite, being, aggressive and being able to fight and, chi block and do all this sort of stuff. She's always speaking, very positive about things, even in sort of the darkest of situations here. So to get her to actually show some sort of like, more anger towards an emotion and towards of why she is the way that she is when people are being sort of critical of her, I think is very sort of key moment for her sort of development, and especially with her sort of dynamic within the group. I think, she definitely bounces back, very fast from this, like everything else that she sort of encounters. But you can see sort of the mask, you could say, drop a little bit here, as well as with, a lot of other characters in this moment.
Ty Lee then turns the questioning onto May, highlighting that, like, okay, I have a lot of sisters, but you're an only child. How does that explain, like, your kind of, like, attention problems? You don't care about anything. So that's the big thing that kind of May gets focused on for. Kind of Zuko, of course, agrees with this. May talks about how her life was good, like, rich, only child, but she adds in, as long as she behaved. And she explains that her mother especially kind of basically said to kind of remain silent, don't have any particular emotions about things, mostly for the sake of her father Ukano's career, which of course is sort of relevant because that's when she's like introduced. She's just with her family, going where they go for his career in New Ozai, and she's just kind of along for the ride. And Azula highlights that, oh, that's why you don't express yourself, is because you were shut down and given out to anytime you did, and that's why you don't show any particular emotion to anything anymore. She does blow up at them about this, kind of saying, like, screaming at everyone else to leave her alone, which Zuko kind of has a positive reaction to, seeing some emotion from her, but she's not ready to kind of restart that relationship just yet. So this is interesting. This one, unlike Ty Lee, where we just didn't know the kind of backstory, you had a sense from Return to Omashu that there was maybe something going on here, that she jumped at the opportunity to kind of get away from her family. And so here's just the further explanation of that, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, what are your thoughts on the May section of this?
Yeah, I think with May, I mean, yeah, she did, immediately jump at the opportunity, and we know that she's no longer only child, but her younger brother definitely has sort of, I guess you could say, taken the focus of the family, away from her, which is seemingly okay with her. Like, she's okay to sort of go out and do her own sort of thing after Ben sort of like cooped up so much. But, the others definitely see sort of her non-reaction to pretty much everything as sort of a detriment, except for, this moment here when she has an outburst here. So no, I think this was definitely, a good way for us as the viewer to sort of get, I guess, at least a little bit more on her thinker, because she is sort of so, closed off in things, and it's just her sort of, very sort of non-emotion towards like everything.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one because I saw some people, like, especially with like when Ashes of the Academy came out, kind of come out and talk about how, oh, they never really cover like where May kind of like stands with regards to, like, is she loyal to the Fire Nation or not? And I think that's kind of part of the idea here, is that she doesn't have strong feelings either way, and in some ways it's like she isn't particularly maybe loyal to the Fire Nation cause because, hey, like, her childhood was affected with her kind of father kind of going for this political career. Like, there's ways to kind of interpret this where, like, it actually links in pretty well, where she's going with the flow because this is what her nation is doing, but once she actually latches onto something she does really care about, as we see with Zuko, she kind of follows his path, and now in the kind of comics has other stuff that she individually is kind of focused on, like the making the Royal Fire Academy for girls kind of better and stuff like that. So they've kind of used this and kind of like expanded on it as kind of time has gone on. But yeah, that's that. Then the attention turns to Zuko and basically why he's so angry at like absolutely everything at this point in time. He talks about how everything should be great because he's back home, everything seems to be going his way, he's talking to his father again, and he kind of lets slip, my father thinks I'm a hero, and they cut to Azula immediately with this. And he's more angry than ever, and this causes everyone to kind of ask the question, who are you angry at? And like Azula's talking about, is it Dad? Is it me? What's going on? And he reveals he's angry at himself because he's confused and he doesn't know kind of right or wrong anymore. This leads to May and Zuko having this kind of makeup moment as they kind of turn their attentions on Azula. But that is the big Zuko moment. I'm angry at myself. So he is aware that like it all comes from his own decisions, and the slow, gradual realization here of he's made the wrong choice and is going to have to make a different choice coming up soon. I've always really liked this moment here, but what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I think him sort of, basically arguing with himself, with everyone sort of giving, a sounding board to his feelings, it really becomes sort of poignant and sort of, important for him to sort of realize sort of what the actual issue is here. And it's not like it's resolved in this moment or anything like that. Like he still has a bit of a ways to sort of go here, but at least he can admit to himself what he's at least feeling here. And that, really speaks a lot to him because he's always, he's such sort of like doubting on everything that he's done, even before this, even before he sort of captured the Avatar, or, disposed of him. He was always sort of doubting, what path he's going to go on and how is he going to get his honor back and stuff like that. So the fact that he's just here questioning the moment after he's, thinks that, or the world thinks that he's had some success here, speaks a lot. It means that, sort of the development that he's done up until this point wasn't all for naught. Like he didn't just completely switch and sort of, become back the bad guy or anything like that. Like he's still on the journey towards something more. What it is, even he doesn't know in this moment at least.
So yeah, then things turn to Azula because Azula's like, great performance, everyone, and then they like, oh, you don't have one of these stories because you're perfect, right? And she basically says, yeah, pretty much. But she then just casually drops the idea of like, oh, I could be annoyed about how like my mother likes Zuko more than me. And then you get the very serious moment of like she thought I was a monster. She was right, and the kind of like mask kind of comes back up like immediately, and we kind of move on. But then it's straight away, this is actually the big dynamic, maybe like the biggest that we've kind of focused on here is like, yeah, this important kind of dynamic here, Ursa and Azula. Now, of course, we know that Ursa never actually called her a monster. That's just, Azula kind of making that up to kind of explain some things here. But the idea that, her mother potentially kind of liked Zuko more is something that plays on her mind at like a lot of times. And this will come up as kind of things go forward. And yeah, we start to get into the dynamic here of like, basically once Azula was revealed to be a firebender, she got the focus from Ozai. He kind of pretty much like abandoned Zuko, and this kind of split the family to a certain degree kind of down the middle and creates the dynamic that we kind of have at this point in time. And that's why it is what it is. But again, it's interesting to see that other side of Azula, that she does have one of these stories like everyone else. It's just she's really unwilling to kind of tackle this in any way, whereas the others kind of are willing to at least have the discussion. Azula kind of shuts it off before she smooths herself out in particular. So what are your thoughts on the Azula reveal here?
Yeah, I think, I guess, with Azula having seemingly the sort of like least social skills out of the whole group here, I guess it kind of makes sense that, even if she is willing to show the cracks, even just a little bit, she pretty much, like you're saying there, she covers it up sort of almost sort of immediately because that's how she knows how to interact with the world and how to interact with anybody in general here. So it almost, that's sort of like what you would almost sort of expect for her. Like she needs more help, in order to sort of recognize the signs of things compared to our other sort of characters here, just because of their sort of experience and how they've led their lives up until this point. And Zuko, he's been all around the world and seen different things and stuff like that. So he knows a lot of of what's going on out there, especially from the other nations, and not just from sort of the Fire Nation perspective of things. So it almost sort of makes sense that he would be, a bit more confused and willing to sort of see that confusion once it's sort of something that he has to confront with versus sort of Zula and, her mom, who, as of right now is out of the picture and is a non-factor. So there's nothing for her to sort of like directly confront, other than sort of like her father and stuff like that. But she doesn't view that as an issue right now.
Yeah, lots of unresolved stuff there. But yeah, I think Tylee is the one to mention. Oh, they are all smoothed out. So they go back to the party and basically wreck the place. This is their kind of team bonding exercise here as they just vandalize Chan's house. And the idea is they're going to get him in a lot of trouble with his father. And yeah, you get the shot at the end, everyone smiling, happy, because they helped each other to destroy a place. And it's a surprisingly perfect kind of moment to end the episode for our characters here, and that like, okay, yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense as they kind of realize that, yeah, we don't need to kind of fit in with the cool crowd on the island. We're better off by ourselves. But what are your thoughts on the final scene here?
Yeah, no, that's a very fun, very classic sort of, way of this sort of group who, are, right now they're sort of like considered the villains of the show, right? So for them to sort of crash a party and destroy it almost kind of makes sense that that's what they would do here. It's not like, the evilest thing or anything like that, but it's something, that they could do at this sort of level here and probably without any sort of repercussions as well because of who they actually are. So no, I like this way that they ended it, and the picture at the end is always fun.
Next episode is 306, The Avatar and The Firelord. Very interesting episode given that some of the most significant new content we have for Avatar are the two Roku novels that are basically based off what we learned in this episode. So we have tons of extra context on like everything in this episode because it's so heavily like referencing this episode. So really interesting one to go back to here because I think it is regarded as one of the better episodes of the show. It's a very important backstory. Everyone loves past Avatar backstory stuff, but it's also important. Like Aang's getting this story, Zuko's getting this story. You wonder specifically why is Zuko getting this story, and the reveal at the end there is one of the best in the series probably. And it's just super interesting that they've waited all of this time to like properly explain this is why the war started, and you kind of realize like, oh yeah, we didn't fully know exactly, just that the Fire Nation attacked, not the why. So actually a very very important episode with the timing, in addition to Iroh speaks again, and that's another big one as well. But yeah, what are your thoughts overall on the Avatar and the Firelord?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think this has always been a standout episode for the lore and the history of Avatar and just sort of why the series is the way, why the story is being set up the way that it actually is. Like, how did it become to this point, considering everything that we've mentioned before? Because, yeah, we know the Fire Nation is attacking everyone, but we don't really know the reason why or, sort of even just sort of like how it started and how it sort of progressed to the point where, 100 years later, is still going on, and people are still very sort of invested in this war and what it's actually going to do. So I think it's very good to give us, as viewers, some sort of context for things going on. And I think, the fact that everything else up until this point was so good, you almost sort of don't, even really sort of think about sort of the idea of what's going on here. We've just sort of been following Aang and his sort of reaction to everything. But, the fact that we get to take a second here to sort of learn the history and actually get to see it sort of played out directly, it really sort of stands out. Being able to sort of show and tell and to get to see characters in sort of their, essentially their prime, and to get to see another avatar on their journey, even if it is in this sort of like abridged format, is very cool to see. Because up until this point, we've only really had Aang as like a major sort of reference point. We haven't really had anything else other than snippets and pieces from other past lives.
So the immediate premise is that Aang has a vision of Roku telling him that he needs to learn the history of the war so he knows how to end the war. Come to my island on the summer solstice and I'll talk to you in detail. At the same time, basically, Zuko receives a mysterious scroll saying that he needs to learn about his great-grandfather, and he immediately is like, oh, Sozin, that's who I need to learn about. So our opening scene here is Zuko going to Azula, basically like, I forgot what we learned in school, tell me what happened to Sozin. She goes on like, oh yeah, he started the war, he was ancient eventually when he died, very successful. How did he die? He died peacefully in his sleep, very, very old. And Zuko's like, okay, even if there's more detail, I'm not sure that answers the core questions that I need. And this is where he finds the secret message on the scroll telling him that the full history is kept in the Dragonbone Catacombs by the Fire Sages. And so he goes there and he reads the final testament of Firelord Sozin. So this is how the story is told. Zuko is reading Sozin's side of this, which is Sozin's own testament, and Aang is directly getting the backstory from Roku via the past life connection here. So that's the setup here. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I like this. I think this is good. I mean, and getting the direct, word of mouth, we've already established that that's something that can be done. So it doesn't feel sort of as odd. And I think, it's interesting that, they have this place in the Fire Nation for Zuko to go to sort of get the true sort of history of things and how it hasn't been sort of like completely destroyed, because we know, Fire Nation, definitely has the idea of sort of skewing history towards their view of things. So the idea that this history is sort of still there, is being hidden, and hasn't already been sort of destroyed, where we know, the Fire Nation has gone to other places and destroyed, Fire Nation history that other people have had access to. So I guess there's something interesting about, the fact that this is still there, and the fact that Iroh knows about it, and we're assuming that Iroh knows it as well.
So yeah, we jump into the flashback, and the big initial reveal here is that Roku and Sozin are both the same age. They actually have the exact same birthday. They are best friends. This is when they're 16 years old here. We see them sparring, and we immediately introduce the idea Roku has a crush on this girl named Ta Min. When Aang sees this, he's like, oh, she didn't even notice you. Roku encourages Aang on the kind of Avatar romance front, and that's our like initial kind of detail there. And then the big thing is, at their basically birthday party, Roku is revealed to be the Avatar by the Fire Sages. And straight away you kind of see the contrast here, in that like the Fire Sages have more political power in the Fire Nation at this point in time than they do presently, because we literally saw that from like season 1. So that is a huge thing. This is the kind of turning point in their dynamic, where this is just Sozin's friend Roku, to now all of a sudden they're on like equivalent levels. They're both world leaders to be in the future. Prince Sozin and Avatar in training Roku. Again, this is where the novels really help, because you have a lot more context behind why Roku and Sozin are friends, like what the nature of their friendship actually is, and that like, oh, Roku had a brother, and actually Sozin was closer with that brother. And Roku was almost on the verge of falling out of that friendship group until Yasu died. And in a way, that's what brought Roku and Sozin closer together. And so that idea of like, you do get it here in this episode that Roku doesn't come across as the most confident character. That's a large kind of reason for that, in terms of the just contrast here between them. So what are your thoughts on some of these early scenes, especially now with the extra context we have from the novels?
Yeah, yeah, it really does speak a lot more, understanding from at least, the additional stuff that they've written in the book, how, they actually interacted in their dynamic and how they were friends and how they sort of developed over time. Because, they're 16 here, so they've already gone through a lot of hardship with, losing Yasu and everything like that. So, they're very sort of friendly at this point here, and you can sort of, it's like you can sort of understand why, at least initially, Roku had such sort of like hesitance towards everything that eventually happens in this episode, just because they were such on sort of like good terms initially here. And I think, even without knowing any of that extra context, I think just from this episode you can see that come through here pretty clear. And just the introduction of Tom in and sort of where that eventually sort of lines up, I think is pretty cool. I don't think I would think as much about Tom Min from just what we see from her in this sort of episode here, but I think it is cool to get to see the visual of them being young here with that added extra context.
Yeah, because even in the books, the idea is like they really, for the most part, only have their first true conversations with each other, kind of like a little bit later on. So the idea that like she doesn't overly notice him here kind of makes sense. But yeah, that's that. Yeah, Roku's revealed to be the Avatar, and then yeah, we get the immediate jump to Roku has to leave to start his training, and we get the scene where Sozin gives Roku the royal artifact, the headpiece for the crown prince, and they kind of say their goodbyes to each other. Now, again, the novel adds more context to this, and that, like, from this episode, this comes across as just a honest kind of expression of friendship from Sozin. From the novels, we know it was actually an idea from Sozin's father, Taiso, to kind of give it over. It still ultimately like works because I don't think the episode maybe places that much importance on the huge significance of the artifact. There's more so the idea of like what Zuko in the future could kind of turn it into as like a symbol going forward. So like I think the retcon from the novels kind of makes sense here because their friendship still is here.
Mm.
It's just that here's a political maneuver to attach Roku a little bit more to the Fire Nation than otherwise. Given the context of Roku not having as much of an attachment to the Fire Nation with the whole dynamic with his family that we learn about as well. Um, so that's all really cool. I still think this kind of works out nicely because them saying goodbye to each other still has tons of meaning because in the novels, this is really presented as like for Sozin, this is him losing his only other friend. Yasu died, and now Roku leaving for who knows how long to do his training is the loss of another friend, and he kind of wonders if he'll kind of find another friend as good as Roku. So there's still impact on both sides of things. It's just it gives a little bit more character to Taiso and that sort of scheming within the royal family, which I do appreciate. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this important scene with the artifact here?
Yeah, no, it definitely is something to take in mind, sort of the behind the scenes political movement that sort of, I guess you could say, initiated this sort of idea of him giving this artifact to Roku here. And I don't know. I think for me it still comes off as like a meaningful moment here, and I think. I don't know. There is maybe a bit more sort of understanding of the importance of the fact that it is such a like royal artifact, but I think you get that context even without understanding sort of the behind the scenes reason of why he's actually sort of doing this. Because I mean, even here they say that he can't take any of his worldly possessions with him because he's going to Air Nation, or just him being an avatar in general and that sort of training, he can't really as much sort of hold on to that sort of stuff there. So I think with that in mind, even if he wasn't sort of asked to do this from his father, the Fire Lord, it still would be a pretty sort of important moment here, and it still would be something that he might consider doing sort of like on his own. Is what I'm trying to think of, is like would Sozin do this without sort of being asked to by his father? And I think I don't know. I want to think that maybe at this point in time they are good enough friends that he would sort of consider this, or he might consider some other sort of artifact that's really close that would be worthy of carrying with Roku going on here. So I don't know. I think that there's a reason that this would still work regardless of the extra context. But yeah, understanding sort of the political sort of undertones that they're trying to do here, that does make this a little bit more of a sadder moment, a somber moment, just because of how this eventually all sort of plays out and how it doesn't really work in that sort of way here. Yeah, I think it's something to definitely keep Roku sort of in the loop here, regardless of any other sort of extra context.
Yeah, and I think it's important also just to have the idea that like it's not just that kind of evil line of Fire Lords. It doesn't just start with Sozin. Like it just almost comes out of nowhere. That there's scheming that's been going on. Things have been changing within the royal family for a few eras now.
Generations.
Yeah, because like we kind of see the start of it in like the Kyoshi novel stuff that they do there, with like trying to shut down the power of some of the clans to establish the power even more. Taiso's trying to maintain the power here while also, again, pitting the family members against each other's stuff. That happens here. And especially with him losing Roku at this point, it's like it sets Sozin off on his like trajectory basically. But yeah, we then go into Roku's training as the Avatar, and this is the part where like this is where the novels like super flesh everything out, because we get his like years and years of training covered here in like four quick montage moments, whereas you actually get so much more context from the novels about like the airbending training and the waterbending training, like especially. So yeah, we established that, of course, in the cycle, he already knows fire, so he goes on to airbending. And what they establish here is that he trained airbending with Monk Gyatso. Not that Gyatso was his master, but just that they were training together. And the point here, this is where they present it, friendships are so strong they can even transcend lifetime. So the idea that Gyatso trained Aang, they're friends, and he also knew Roku and was a member of his team Avatar, as we find out. And that's a huge example of the novels. Monk Gyatso is more than just the kind of name drop here. The actual dynamic he has with Roku is really interesting, and some of the connections they make to eventually kind of older Monk Gyatso is kind of really, really interesting. Then we go on to his waterbending training here. We establish that this was his biggest struggle here, as he has this fight against his master, Tagukak here. Now, even from the novels, we don't have too much extra context on this, other than the struggle to eventually be trained by Tagukak, that actually Malkito kind of thought him kind of waterbending initially. And then, clearly at this point in time, there may be more leaning into the idea of like, oh, water's the opposite of fire, so that's Roku's struggle, in the same way that like Aang's is earth. More so than maybe the direct personality issue or like what you've dealt with in your life, and that like the reason it's such a struggle is because Yasu died by drowning in the water and there's like trauma attached to this. But it's still clever. It works kind of both ways, with novel or just on its own. It's pretty interesting. The earthbending training, again, very quick montage. Sud, they have the race up the mountain. Roku wins. And this one's kind of cool because the Free Comic Book Day book we got just very recently, started the month, directly covers the like leading into this. Not tons of extra detail, but it's like, oh, this is what was happening just prior to this happening. And then, of course, we get the classic Avatar, now a master of all elements. He uses all four of them at the same time. Very, very cool. So yeah, what are your thoughts on Roku's training montage?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the montage has always been a cool sort of highlight of this episode. I think, getting to see another Avatar, even in this sort of like brief sped up version of it, I think is very cool to see, and get to see a character that we know Aang was also his mentor later on. Getting to see him at sort of a younger age here with Gyatso, I think is very cool. And yeah, just understanding now that we have a lot more understanding of Gyatso's sort of personality and sort of how him and Roku sort of interacted, and why it makes sense that, they would say, such a friendship could transcend lifetimes. Now you can understand how much Roku and Gyatso sort of meant to each other if you've read the story. So I really like that we have that now. And even though, yeah, you're like you said, we don't have too much of him in the Water Tribe, in the Water Nation. No, we know a little bit more of how he interacted with the people and sort of his views on the people in general, and how eventually he was, able to be trained in water bending, and how that eventually all turned out. So no, I like it. I think the montage here is not too much, but I think it just stands out in the fact that it's just another way that we've seen the Avatar learn all the elements, and that was sort of the could say the sort of more sort of traditional way of Avatar sort of learning the elements. So we have an understanding of what would have been sort of the normal way for Aang if he didn't sort of run away and everything sort of changed.
Yeah, and then the other thing from the novels that also like this montage maybe doesn't get across, and it leans into maybe some of the perception people have of Roku as an avatar, is just that he does stuff as the avatar in between all these things, like especially like after finishing
Yeah.
training, like he is a super active avatar. It's just the focus of this story is at this point on he meets Sozin again and that dynamic, not everything else he did as the avatar. Um, but yeah, he then returns to the Fire Nation. We find out that they are still friends, even after all of these years. Sozin is his best man at his wedding to Ta Min, so that relationship does happen. Um, at the wedding later on, Sozin, this is the big moment, especially if you've recently read the novels. The build up to kind of this moment's kind of quite good. Sozin reveals his ambitions to Roku, wanting to spread the prosperity of the Fire Nation to the other nations, basically expanding the Fire Nation into other nations, and immediately Roku shuts it down. Again, some of the context from the novels of like the Crown Prince artifact, it's meant to be this year-long build-up of like he'll have some loyalty to the Fire Nation after all the build-up, and you only getting to see each other after all these years. But no, immediately Roku's just like, no, the four nations must remain four. He's been active as the Avatar, doing stuff across all the other nations. He is a spirit of all nations, not just a Fire Nation Avatar. And the whole Crown Prince artifact thing doesn't mean all that much in this specific case. So Roku straight up shuts down the ambition of wanting to expand the Fire Nation elsewhere. But that is the kind of core idea of where the war comes from, is the Fire Nation is having all of this prosperity, which again, as far as we're aware, is some of that comes from the Lombok Island material in terms of like their military being the best in class, the advancements in technology and stuff like that. That's where the prosperity kind of comes from, and why not help everyone out? But actually, it's him wanting to take over. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this moment, especially after the novels? Like, this moment has like a lot of impact of like finally Roku sees the ambitions of Sozin very, very clearly here.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I like that Roku does sort of stick to his, ideas, his sort of convictions here, and he's very sort of, not for it at all, which I think, considering at this point and, what we're assuming to be his age and stuff, like he's been around for a while, he's interacted with people, like he's been like an avatar, sort of in the sort of traditional sense of what an avatar does. So he kind of understands that sort of, one taking over another isn't really going to go down well, and that he'll have to get involved with it, which eventually he does have to. So yeah, it's really something that, it really wouldn't speak well of the situation of anything going forward here. And I don't know, it almost makes me wonder sort of like, we know from the book and stuff like this, like, we've known that Sozin has had, very sort of, high ambitions for what he can do and for what the Fire Nation can do. And especially with the Lombok material and how we're presuming that has sort of influenced their military and just their sort of, economical power up until this point, really, speaks towards what Sozin has already, been sort of gearing up to, even if Roku hasn't been very aware of it in that sort of sense here. And yeah, I think, I don't know, maybe Sozin sort of like overestimated sort of the loyalty that, Roku would have towards the Fire Nation and towards him being a friend, which I don't know. This is the part where it kind of makes me wonder, because I feel like sort of I feel like the cracks were sort of like, at least from reading the book, at least, these sort of cracks were already sort of being shown there because we can see that, even though Roku still didn't want to admit by the end of the book that, Sozin really did anything sort of like obviously bad, we can see that there's something there that would cause, maybe even a little bit of a rift here. And here it just makes it sort of seem like, they're 100% okay or whatever like that. So I don't know. I wonder about that sort of progression sometimes, but I think, it's a very sort of key moment here in terms of Roku standing his ground and not sort of thinking the Fire Nation is one above any of the others.
Yeah, this is definitely the thing you can tell was maybe the biggest struggle in writing the novels was that the
Yeah.
giant time gaps that are kind of like built into Avatar and the Firelord are kind of difficult to write around because it's like, oh, they don't see each other for 12 years. They meet again, then they don't see each other for another 10 years, and it's like without like tons more context, it's like, huh? And that's partly on some of the writing of this episode. That like, yeah, it's just a difficult thing to do to have to establish that like, oh yeah, these characters don't speak for like a decade, and what does that exactly mean? I think the Randy Rabai does the best he can with the kind of complicated sort of like continuity that we have here. In that, yeah, Roku has doubts about Sozin, but it's the idea that I guess he never just overtly sees Sozin directly do anything bad. He hears
Mhm.
about like, oh, other people say this, other people say that, but like I've never seen it myself quite. And here's the first time it's like, okay, but I've warned you against it. And then as we go into the next scene, later on he learns that Sozin has actually done this. He has made the first Fire Nation colonies in the Earth Kingdom, and he immediately moves to confront him. Again, this is another one where a time skip kind of creates the problem of like, why does he take so long to come around to this? Why didn't he hear about this like immediately? But it is that idea of Sozin has done a lot of stuff in secret. That's the whole premise of the Roku era, is that it's this kind of like Cold War era where everyone's doing stuff in secret because we can't do it out in the open because Kyoshi was such a menace in like the previous era. Like anyone who would like openly do something, she would come down on them. And that's why we get this shift into the Roku era to be more political scheming and stuff like that. And then Sozin in particular hiding things away from Roku, like the whole what happened to Princess Zaison thing is, I think everyone I think assumes it's a he secretly had her taken out at some point and Roku never knew about this, is sort of the idea. And there's a bunch of other stuff that like he never particularly like learns about. And it's um the other thing is like that, like you have Kyoshi having a somewhat similar situation, maybe worse, with the whole Chin the Conqueror thing, where like she doesn't step in the second he takes over that first town in the Earth Kingdom, or the second, or the third, or the fourth. She waits until Ba Sing Se and Yokoya are the only places left. And again, people go crazy at Roku for like not being fully aware that this happened. Um, Again, there's a story here behind like the specifics of how Sozin did this in secret, but like the point is it creates this now aggressive confrontation between Sozin and Roku, where this time he comes to see him. Previously the banter immediately got back to their friends. That doesn't happen this time. Sozin attacks Roku. Roku, so much more powerful, defeats him, shows the scope of his power with the Avatar state, as in, you could never defeat me in combat, and spares him with the threat that if you step out of line ever again, I will kill you. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this? Sozin goes ahead, makes some colonies, and Roku deals with it at this point in time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, it's something because, like, we know eventually what sort of happens here. So, we think maybe Roku could have been a bit more, strict on things, but, still, at least up until this point, from, this episode's point of view, they were good friends up until this sort of point here. So, they didn't really have any sort of direct issues, any sort of direct confrontations, but once we see their, Sozin's true ambitions, like you're saying there, Roku is pretty quick to act, and he is pretty active in it. And I think, without knowing everything else, you can see like, all right, maybe give him one sort of chance here. You showed him how strong you are. Let's see how things sort of go here. But I don't know. It's one of those things where, you want to think that the Avatar would be more aware of things, but he's only aware of things as much as he's involved with them. And if he's not involved in Fire Nation sort of doings, why would he necessarily know what's sort of going on? So I don't know. This is a weird thing where the Avatar is supposed to be sort of very attentive to the world and everything like that, because that's sort of like his job as like a pseudo world leader, or at least a moderator of things. But he is just sort of one person, and he can't necessarily be everywhere in the world at one time. So it's a hard role to be the Avatar, which I think is something that we see from every era of Avatar. Like there's no clear cut way to be sort of like the best, the perfect Avatar, and it usually winds up being the next Avatar that has to fix the problems of the previous ones. So it's definitely a difficult situation to be on. And we have a little bit more context from the books to see sort of that Sozin's true ambitions was probably always to sort of expand in some way, or to sort of exude their influence over the other nations, even if it wasn't sort of direct as what we see he's finally done in this sort of episode here. But we know that he was always sort of like meddling in other nations' affairs, and Roku's even sort of like okay with that. Like he knows that other nations and that the Fire Nation has spies and stuff like that. Like he is a Fire Nation national. Like he is from sort of the upper class of Fire Nation society. So he's not like unaware of things, but he is not in sort of the back end dealings of things, which maybe that's a detriment to Roku. Maybe he should have been more involved with that, but he has a lot more to deal with than just the Fire Nation there. So it's something to see how he deals with everything.
Yeah, and that is the other point. You get this in like the RPG, especially, that there are other conflicts that he has to be involved in. Like Roku, it doesn't seem like maybe when he's older have like a full on team Avatar. He has like a team across the nations of people that like work with him, like Tagukak and Sud at times. But yeah, there are conflicts all over the place. Like the Northern Water Tribe have a conflict with the Earth Kingdom over this kind of trade passage up north. That's something he might have to deal with, and that would distract him from anything going on in like the first Earth Kingdom colony when it happens. Plus, like I said before, Sozin clearly does a lot of what he does here in secret. It's not this open thing where like Roku is immediately alerted to this fact if it's done particularly in secret. And yeah, like he is just a person in an era where people are hiding secrets from each other, from like all the nations. But yeah, this is the big thing with Roku in terms of like, especially how he's perceived as an avatar. Every time that worst avatar discussion comes up, it is Roku who is the one that everyone goes to these days. Like I think some people try and get across the point that it's Korra, but I think in the end these days it is Roku, and it's all because he doesn't kill Sozin here. And I've always struggled with this because I don't really see how it's like a super strong point to argue that he should have just killed him here, because that would have caused like a world shifting event as well. And it's very much a hindsight argument as well, because it's one thing Roku like wanting to think the best of Sozin, and it's another for him to like assume that he will then go on to like genocide one of the whole nations. Like I don't think there's many characters who think that Sozin kind of would ever make that order. Like obviously the Lombok Island thing is like gives you the impression that like okay, he kind of has it in him, but like none of our characters kind of fully saw him make that decision. So it's always a tricky thing here, because I don't think Roku is ever going to be in a situation where he just assumed Sozin would ever go that far. And especially with what seems like other context from just Air Nation stuff happening in the Fire Nation in the Roku era that we know about, adding to that. It's just like, yeah, the Avatar killing the Fire Lord over this, that's a crazy messy situation. And does Roku come out of that okay? What happens? That's so messy. So, what are your thoughts on that whole idea that Roku? I think if you just polled the whole fandom, he is what who people regard to be the worst Avatar. Do you think he made a particularly egregious error by not just killing Sozin in this moment?
Yeah, I don't think it's that sort of cut and dry. I think, sort of taking a world leader out of the position, that creates a huge power vacuum. And yeah, he might have heirs and stuff like that that can move into the position or other high ranking generals, but that really does sort of like, it really does sort of like upset the balance of things. And the Avatar's whole role is to main balance in the world, right? So, he's probably considering that factor in addition to their sort of, friendship in the past, in terms of what would actually happen if he did sort of take him out of the picture there. Now, could he have done other things to sort of censure sort of the Fire Nation in this sort of case here? I don't know. Maybe he could have, but I mean, again, the Avatar isn't really sort of like an official position. Like he doesn't have like a backing of a nation behind him or anything like that. Like he doesn't even have sort of like the White Lotus as sort of like a pseudo backup organization. Like that's not really role that the Avatar sort of has here. He's more of an advisor of things, and people can choose to ignore their advisors, right? So there's that whole sort of issue, and thinking that he would go as far as he does eventually go, that does seem like a large leap. Even knowing sort of like the means and the ways that he will go for different things in the past. I don't think that's a very sort of extreme measure. But again, maybe if Roku knew more of the sort of secret dealings that Sun was doing, maybe he might have considered that more. But he's not really aware of that. So, yeah, I mean, I guess, in terms of avatars, maybe he is sort of the lower scale of them, but, we only have so many in terms of our reference point here. And it's a very hard picture to sort of see things from hindsight.
Yeah, and then the other point is, of course, like why don't the Fire Nation colonies get like broken up or whatever, stopped once he does discover them? And I suppose this comes down to like kind of the same problem we encounter in like The Promise, which is sort of that like once it happens, it's a messy thing to try and revert back regardless. Mostly because the second he challenges Sozin, suddenly he's quote unquote an enemy of the Fire Nation, and that like he's not going to get the support of the Fire Nation to back away from those Earth Kingdom colonies. And then if he just works with the Earth King to oust the Fire Nation, he's starting a war there, basically, or at least choosing a side in a war that will inevitably happen. And so the war just starts earlier in that case. So the only thing he kind of really can do is sort of like stay in the middle and do effectively what he does, and it works. Like his threat works as far as we're aware. He says, if you step out of line, I will kill you. And we're not told of anything that Sozin does in the intervening, like, was it 10, 15 years or whatever, between these two encounters. That's the whole point of kind of what happens at the end here, is that with you out of the way, now I can accomplish everything I need to do. Like, Sozin is properly scared of like being taken out by Roku if he does do anything, so he's even more careful than usual. So it's an interesting one. It works. Like, again, like a lot of situations like the Kyoshi Jin the Conqueror thing, I'd love some piece of content to explain it, the political kind of landscape a little bit more, to fully understand every dynamic, and that like it's clearly not as simple as simply presented. But it's interesting to talk about, is the main thing. So, yeah, moving on with the episode. Sozin doesn't act out, but years later, the volcano on Roku's island erupts violently, causing a full evacuation. Roku does his best to fight the volcano to save his home, but it is this truly massive eruption, so much so that Sozin can actually feel the kind of earth shaking from the Fire Nation capital, the island, the main island. Roku, does some crazy bending to try and save the island. This is like 10, 20 times worse than the volcano Aang had to fight. It just continues to erupt even more. There's a lot more toxic gas involved here. He very carefully uses the Avatar state to kind of redirect the lava flow, but it seems like the island is ultimately lost. And it feels like a lot of what's happening here is just that, like, this is such a vicious, like, eruption. They're trying to stop, like, permanent damage to, like, surrounding regions, not just, like, somehow save the island. But anyway, Sozin arrives to help on his dragon. They work together pretty nicely to, it seems like, just calm things down at least a little bit, so it's not, like, crazy destructive beyond what it already is. Roku has a moment where he saves Sozin's life from a bad fall with earthbending, but the moment then happens. Roku is hit by a big blast of the toxic gas, is stunned, he now needs help, and Sozin, this is where he sees his moment. He has a chance to now act freely with Roku out of the way, so he leaves on his dragon, leaves his best friend to die, and we get the very tragic moment of Fang, Roku's dragon, coming in to die with him, and we see kind of Aang being born pretty much immediately afterwards. And so this explains, Aang being born, how the war started. We'll get into what Sozin does afterwards in a second, but what are your thoughts on the kind of final kind of sequence here with Roku alive?
Yeah, I mean, it was cool getting to see him battle the mountain, I think, or the volcano. I think, getting to see him going up and down and sort of, being able to create the trenches and sort of redirect the flow, again, seeing Sozin, sort of deheat the lava, sort of, create the steam and everything. I mean, I think, getting to see Roku, seemingly control the volcano, the lava to some degree. Is that fully lava bending? Is it not? I don't know, but it's still cool visual to see there. I think it really sort of set the stage of, him being maybe not at his peak, but he's, very knowledgeable and using, all the elements to his benefit, or the ones that he can use in this instance. And it's only, unfortunate to see that, this is something where, the natural sort of disasters, even too much for the Avatar to sort of handle on his own, especially at his current, age in life here. And Sozin is able to, unfortunately, take advantage to it, for all of his future plans.
It's so interesting. I think just the idea of, like, Sozin goes there, and the only thing I can think of like is that, like, this is absolutely wanting to help out. I don't think there's any way he can possibly, before he arrives, know, like, what specifically is happening and stuff like that. He actually comes here to check on his friend because this crazy thing is happening, and then it's just like, oh, the one time I might ever have, like, the opportunity to kind of get rid of him, he thinks about his ambitions, and it's like, yeah, I'm taking this. I won't save you in this moment. That's what's kind of so interesting about this, is that, like, yeah, he doesn't come here to kill Roku. It's just that ends up happening after they have this kind of final teamwork moment together. It's very, very interesting. But did you have any thoughts on that? Just like the characterization of him showing up in the first place?
Yeah. I mean, I think it did feel like, at least at this moment, even without knowing the extra context of things, it felt like someone just wanting to support and wanted to help. But I think, we know at this point, maybe not as much from this flashback, but especially with the context from the book, he's very opportunistic in sort of what he wants to do and the endeavors and the lengths that he'll take to achieve his sort of goals here. So it's not surprising to me that he would sort of leave him to die here. I don't think he would have sort of, like, actively backstabbed him after the volcano and everything, like, if things turned out perfectly. I don't think he would have done that in this case here. It might even have helped their sort of friendship a little bit better. I think, Sozin, we know he's all 100% about sort of his goals and his ambitions, regardless of anything else that's going on. So, yeah, that's just sort of how it played out, and it worked out for Sozin in this case, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And then we get the story as we kind of mostly know it. Sozin waits for the comet. He has his military all built up. He uses the comet to wipe out the air nomads. Mostly just because he wants to find the next Avatar, because he knows the Avatar is the main threat. The Avatar has, restricted his plans for all these years because he can't beat him. He doesn't want another Avatar to rise up and have another thing to deal with. So this is why he wipes out the air nomads. And he basically says it himself in his own kind of last will and testament that he wastes the rest of his life searching in vain for the last airbender. But he never finds him because, of course, Aang is in a kind of ball of ice and energy underneath the kind of Southern Water Tribe. And it's like, it's an interesting kind of, it's such a clever use of like the show's title for like, oh, Sozin is the one to say the last airbender. And it's like, oh, that makes complete sense. But yeah, just the idea that he gets the benefit of some of his plans coming to fruition, but ultimately he's so lost in his own search for, and I suppose fear of the Avatar, that like, Azula, like the storybooks, the history books, I suppose, say like he lived an amazing life because he does live to be over 100. He passes away peacefully, but it's like, does he? He passes away worried that there's an Avatar out there, and that's kind of an interesting angle on it. But what are your thoughts on this kind of direct setup for the war that happens then here?
Yeah. I mean, it's something to see sort of how, the Fire Nation wants to slant his sort of final years versus what he was actually sort of feeling and sort of wondering and sort of, his just sort of, I guess you could just say, just general animosity towards, the Air Nation and Air Nomads in general because of Roku and taking his best friend away from him, and how, he has this ambitions, these plans, and like you said, it does seem like most of them come to pass. Like he's able to sort of start this war, start, sort of their expansion to other places. And it does seem to work, but he's, he knows that there's something that can get in the way of his plans, and he can't sort of let that go. So it's something that he's sort of stuck doing till he passes away. But yeah, it's definitely, something that finally understand after watching the show up to this point, how the war sort of actually started and sort of what was the origin of it.
So we then cut over to Zuko, who, even after hearing this full story, remains unsatisfied. Like, okay, I know Sozin's full story. What does that mean? And he confronts Iroh directly about this, that, like, he was still alive in the end. That, like, his death, okay, he lived a really long life, but what were you trying to say? And Iroh reveals, no, he wasn't still alive in the end. You have more than one great-grandfather, Sozin on your father's side, but your mother's grandfather is Avatar Roku. And so this is this huge kind of massive reveal, families interconnected, that, oh, Ursa's related to Roku, and that means Zuko is related to an Avatar. And Iroh directly says it, that this explains Zuko's nature, the conflict within him between good and evil, right and wrong. Things can now be resolved in the kind of current era. Zuko has the opportunity to cleanse the sins of their family and the Fire Nation. He can help to restore balance. And Iroh then gives Zuko the very same Crown Prince artifact, with the idea being that this is the direct setup of, like, you leading the Fire Nation is something that can kind of help things going forward. It's, as we kind of get to the end here, the Avatar and the Firelord, one dynamic of this is what started the war, and a potential new dynamic of this could end the war with Aang and Zuko as potentially the new Firelord. That's the idea that's being kind of implanted at this point in time. Huge reveal here with just some of the kind of politics and stuff like this, in terms of, like, yeah, how does this happen? And you have to get to, like, the Search comic to eventually kind of, like, explain it, and that, like, okay, of course, in their quest for power, they want to add even more powerful bloodlines into the Fire Nation royal family. That's why this happens. And it's like, okay, that actually makes a lot of sense, but it's super interesting for Zuko. What are your thoughts on this big reveal? Iroh talking again, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it definitely was a big reveal. I remember that being like, "Oh, that's crazy." But yeah, I mean, no, it wouldn't necessarily be something that you would think. Of course, he has two grandparents. That's sort of how it works. But knowing the history of the other one is something that they probably wouldn't necessarily care about knowing as much about, because unless they're like super famous or have someone else that's part of the Fire Nation, that's not really what they're sort of concerned about. And he wouldn't necessarily have learned that history, considering his mother sort of disappeared, and we don't really know what happened to them, at least not in terms of the story itself proper here. So yeah, I think it's definitely something to see and to understand that he has this sort of duality within himself, and that he could potentially be the one to fix the sins of the fathers and stuff like that here. And Zuko's, of course, now he sort of gets the picture, but of course he's still sort of like frustrated at the situation here, because he doesn't still know exactly what he's going to do to sort of fix this sort of stuff here. But I think it definitely is cool that he's aware of this and that he has this sort of lineage sort of behind him. I think it definitely makes it more of a intriguing story knowing the history here.
And then the episode ends going back to Aang and Co. So he's told the story that he learned from Roku to his team, and they mostly focus on the betrayal aspect of it. But Aang actually, his takeaway is that everyone is worth giving a chance, even the Fire Nation. That even though we're fighting against them, you know, there's good in the Fire Nation. That sort of idea. It's sort of a setup a little bit for Zuko will be important. You have to give him a chance as well, and that will be an important dynamic going forward. And then especially they focus on the idea of, can friendships last more than one lifetime? Hopefully. And then because of Korra, we actually know in some cases it's true, because Katara trains Korra, Toph trains Korra, that sort of thing. It actually makes complete sense, and especially because like Toph, I think, is the one to particularly be kind of like somewhat emotional over the idea that friendships can last one lifetime, and she does directly train Korra. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the Aang ending of the episode?
Yeah, no, I like this. I think, he would be the character to sort of realize and sort of understand sort of the idea of, the story he's being told, and how maybe not everyone's exactly sort of evil, how maybe there's more nuance to them. He seems like, the character that would be willing to take that leap of faith. Like he's already sort of asked, Zuko before, like, if things were different, could we have been friends? So I think that this is, it's a great story for him to sort of, reinforce the ideas that he has, that maybe not everything's sort of black and white. Maybe there is some sort of nuance that can be held there. And also sometimes maybe you need to be decisive as well. So, it's something that he's going to have to grow and learn and figure out. And hopefully his friends will be there to continue with him and help support him in these sort of decisions. And maybe it can even go even farther than their own sort of lifetimes here, which we see how that plays out. So no, I thought this was a great way to sort of end it here on sort of like Aang and sort of his idea of what could happen in the future.
And then our last review for the episode is going to be on Korra, the Korra side of things, K311 The Ultimatum. So this is effectively the first of three episodes that make up the finale for Book 3. So we're in the kind of setup, but also we get some of the action here. So yeah, we'll jump in here with this one. I quite enjoy this episode. I think there's some really kind of good stuff here. I like a little bit of focus on Mako and Bolin and their family at the start. We get a pretty nice reunion as like all the characters are kind of finally back together here. And then the drama as the action starts at the Northern Air Temple. Some amazing fights. Tenzin gets some of his best moments here as well. And just in general, you see kind of Book 3 at its kind of best. What I think people like the most is just some of the crazy action that ends up actually happening here. But just there's dramatic and intense moments like in every single scene almost. So it's a really, really strong episode. But overall, what are your thoughts on The Ultimatum?
No, I agree. It's a strong episode. I think, just getting to see the results of everything that the Red Lotus has done, and to get to see our characters react to it in real time and with, a sense of urgency, really comes across pretty clearly in this one. And I think even though it does have a lot of action, there is, good moments of here where they're sort of like pausing to sort of like reflect on things and sort of search out things. So I think despite it being sort of the lead up to the end of things, it does give you at least a good amount of time to actually sort of breathe with things going on. But it is very sort of back and forth throughout the whole episode, which I think is pretty cool. I think this is a good way to sort up the more sort of, I guess you could say, like action heavy episodes in the later half of the season.
So we see we start off with Mako and Bolin in Ba Sing Se. Of course, they've just been freed, but they've been told by Zahir to deliver a message. Now, later on, we get the message, and this is why it's so important for them to kind of act quickly. Is that the message is that Zahir is coming after the Northern Air Temple. He will take out the new Air Nation if Korra doesn't hand herself over. So they have a very important piece of information here, but they're kind of stuck in the middle of Ba Sing Se. They don't exactly know where Korra is at this point in time. So there's a lot of work to be done here and not a lot of time to do it in. So, of course, there's looting taking place all across Ba Sing Se. They're in the upper ring. They go to get an airship. People are looting the airship, the low-quality airship, as we learned from the last episode. And they eventually get the airship kind of going and take off. And they immediately, as they're going over the lower ring, realize, oh, this is really bad what's happening in the city. Like, there's chaos, fire is affecting like most of the lower ring, and so their family is in danger here. So they stop temporarily to get their family out of this situation. There's a little bit of drama here as Grandma Yin initially doesn't want to leave because this is her home. She can't abandon her home. Bolin tries to convince her. That doesn't quite work. You think that his emotional words will get through, but it doesn't. So he just grabs her, and she's ultimately okay in the end. So they get on the airship and leave. And then the search for Korra, which Mako's actually quite clever here, kind of figuring out like, oh, we'll follow this path and we'll probably come across her. They kind of basically cover the path of Korra and Asami through the last episode and eventually find their way to the Misty Palms Oasis, where we'll have the reunion in just a moment. But what are your thoughts on this opening sequence here of Mako and Bolin getting themselves and their family out of Ba Sing Se?
I like this. I think it feels like it's right for them to sort of, take a second, cover their family because they can see sort of the danger that the city holds here. They have this airship that they can somehow manage to operate, even though it was sort of being taken apart before they got to it there. So no, I like this. I think, it's really cool to get to see the brothers sort of, work together and to get their family back together here. And Bolin, having this sort of heartfelt moment, which, like you said, you think would work, but no, it doesn't quite work. But I think it worked with everyone else. And I don't know, it makes sense that the oldest person who's been around the longest would sort of want to stay, sort of where they've sort of been their whole sort of life here. But yeah, like you said, it does seem like she's pretty okay with it.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the reunion then happens. They're first found by Pabu and Naga, find the brothers. Korra and Asami then come out. So big Team Avatar reunion here. Then, of course, the older characters come out, and so we get the fun moment of Bolin meets Zuko for the first time, and he's absolutely freaking out about this because he's meeting like one of Aang's Team Avatar. So that's a fun moment. Grandma Yin meets Asami and Korra, and there's a bit of a romance joke here as she asks Mako why he isn't dating someone like one of these girls. That's a fun little moment. He then delivers the message. Zahir is heading to the Northern Air Temple, and he will wipe out the new Air Nation unless Korra turns herself in. So that's the choice that Korra is met with here, is she has to help the new Air Nation. That's what she's all about. So she's almost forced into this sacrifice play. But the thing that has to happen first is immediately alert Tenzin to the fact that they're on their way. Maybe they can avoid this situation from getting into a really bad state, but there's no ability to actually get in touch with the temple from here. So they first have to go to Zaofu to get a proper communicator to make this happen. But yeah, what are your thoughts on some of these reunion moments? A lot of characters coming together at the Misty Palms Oasis here.
Yeah, no, I think this is cool. I think whenever we get our characters back together after they've been split apart is always sort of like a fun scene here, and get to see the dynamics of our characters, get to see the family's reaction to Pabu and Naga, who, I guess they wouldn't be, as versed in these sort of animal creatures. I think it's very cool to get to see all those sort of mini interactions here, and Bolin being sort of the fanboy. I think kind of makes sense here. But yeah, I think it's a good way to sort of take a mini break here. But again, we get right back into the seriousness when we get the sort of ultimatum of the Red Lotus here, and it's unfortunate, but I guess it makes sense that the radio would be destroyed and they couldn't communicate a longer distance here. So it's a good setup for things to come.
Korra initially has an idea of she can potentially delay Zahir by like maybe somehow trapping him in the spirit world, kind of engaging him in there. So she meditates into the spirit world, into Zaibao's grove, doesn't find him there, but does actually encounter Iroh. So for like the second time in the spirit world, she has a conversation with Iroh. She asks for some advice, and she talks about how like the first Avatar since Wan not to have a past life to talk to. I really need some help. And Iroh basically just advises her to talk to Zuko, because Zuko was a close confidant of Aang. Use his the information he has as a kind of past lifestyle thing. And she's like, oh yeah, sure, absolutely, thanks Iroh. She heads out, and basically that's what was going to happen. So she goes over to Zuko, who's on his way to leave, because we now know that the Red Lotus are specifically targeting world leaders. They've already killed one. They're after Korra, of course. So he's heading back to the Fire Nation to protect his daughter, Firelord Izumi. But before he goes, she asks for some advice. And this is quite a nice scene here, because Zuko notes that Aang would be very happy with kind of what's happening here, like the return of airbenders. This was his greatest dream, and I think he might have sacrificed anything to make this happen, protect it. But he was also, an active Avatar. He was aware of the responsibilities of the Avatar, that the world needs an Avatar. So, there's some sense to be made for not maybe sacrificing yourself. She then reveals to him that it was Iroh who told her to ask him, and Zuko's absolutely stunned by this reveal. He is clearly has no idea that Iroh is in the spirit world, and she tells him that he's in the spirit world, and we don't get his reaction to this because the plot just has to move on, but there's a clear sense that Zuko's probably noted in the back of his head, need to go to spirit world, which is a fun little moment here. But yeah, this is really good here. I really like this setup of just, let's, without the past lives in play, let's go to someone who advised an Avatar. That makes a lot of sense. What are your thoughts on this Korra Zuko stuff and the build up to it?
Yeah, no, it really is sort of the next best thing that you can do here, and it's unfortunate that she doesn't have access, but she does have access to a lot of the people that were around when Aang was around. So I think it's a good use of her resources and her just sort of understanding the situation here. And yes, it's always interesting to see Iroh come back into the mix of things and him give his sort of pearls of wisdom. Even if he doesn't directly have the answer, he always sort of leads you on the right sort of path here. And I think, it definitely would be something, and we've noted this before, sort of like Zuko sort of connecting again with Iroh in the spirit world, and just sort of how that would play out in the future. But no, I think this is very good. It's very quick, but it leads Korra on sort of a course of action, which is what she's known for doing and what she wants to do. Like, she wants to do something.
When they head back in, they have got in touch with the temple. Bolin is having a kind of fruitless conversation with Milo on the radio. Korra takes over and immediately commands Milo to get Tenzin. She gets in touch with him. But the warning comes in at basically the exact moment that Zahir has already arrived at the Northern Air Temple. So Tenzin has to immediately rush into organizing everyone, trying to evacuate the temple here because of how dangerous they are. So, he rounds everyone up. We see Ghazan initially launch his attack against the location where Kai and everyone are. Opal gets captured by Ming Hua, and Zahir drops down in front of Tenzin. So just because of the initial hostages, it seems like the Red Lotus have won already, with everyone kind of like gathered up. So the the attack, the Red Lotus being able to use the air nomads as hostages has kind of come to pass here. But it is interesting that we get this moment where you think, oh, it's just a hostage situation. We're just waiting for Korra. But when Zahir actually just tells Tenzin that, oh yeah, we're just holding you as bait for Korra, this is what causes Tenzin to kind of stand up and like not just remain an inactive prisoner. He doesn't want to just be used that way to sacrifice Korra. So he kind of steps up, he attacks. He sends the three Red Lotus members in front of him flying. So it's everyone except Pali. And he tells Jinora to lead the evacuation. And he gets his siblings to kind of stand with him against the Red Lotus. And so this is the kind of setup for your fight. It's going to be like 3-on-3, Tenzin, Kaya, and Bumi against Gazan, Minghua, and Zahir, with Pali on the airship, kind of just stopping anyone from kind of fleeing. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the kind of setup stuff here? The temple actually does get attacked, and then Tenzin kind of launches his big heroic defense.
Yeah, no, I mean, this feels very sort of on point for what Tenzin would do. Like he does, I mean, he's very sort of like, action oriented as well. Like he's very sort of in the mix of things when he has to be. I mean, he's still, it thinks he could, or attempts to take sort of the peaceful way, but he's very much sort of a go and do person thing, especially considering that he is an airbender who's, generally considered their personalities more chill. But I think, in an effort to sort of protect his pupil and protect his sort of people, he definitely wants to sort of stand up and fight against things here. And I like that he brings his siblings who would be sort of the most sort of like mature and sort of most sort of like ready warriors, even though considering their ages, in the situation here. So now I like this, and initially it looks like maybe this might be sort of an even-ish sort of keel type of things here, but we do know that the Red Lotus are very sort of dangerous, and that's sort of the whole sort of crux of things, is how sort of powerful and how sort of ruthless they can sort of be.
Mm-hmm. We then highlight that the group that has like Kai and Jinora, who are kind of leading the escape, they can't get over to the Sky Bison because Pali is directly overhead, waiting for someone to kind of step out of cover. We then see the fights kind of take place. So Tenzin versus Zahir, Kaya versus Minghua, and Bumi versus Gazan. So the Battle of the Airbenders is very interesting because you see the difference between a true master airbender and a kind of master martial artist who has airbending. And so Tenzin actually has the advantage in this fight, and if it was to continue, it looks like he was about to win. Kaya versus Minghua is quite even, but eventually the tides begin to turn against Kaya. But it is a pretty cool fight in the build-up to this, where it's quite even. Kaya seems to get the victory blow, kind of sending Minghua over the edge, but Minghua goes into her crazy like octopus form, and this kind of turns the fight in her favor. Bumi versus Gazan is where like the Red Lotus have the complete advantage here, because Bumi is not a master bender, so he's mostly just dodging Gazan's attacks. He has one moment where he nearly gets a kind of chokehold in on Gazan, but it's mostly a bit of a comedy, kind of he nearly reverses the situation around. But yeah, Bumi and Kaya, in a lot of trouble, are eventually forced into a situation where they have to like let go, fall off the side of the cliff to kind of survive an explosion. At the same time, Kai makes his big move, creating a distraction for the others to try and escape, dodging Pali's explosions, but is eventually forced to kind of pretty much take an explosion head on. And Jinora sees him kind of blown out of the sky, so she thinks Kai has just been killed. And that's the big tension of this moment, is that there's a lot of like threat to characters here, and especially because the Queen has been killed, we're not entirely sure our characters are safe in this moment. But what are your thoughts on the action kind of up to this point?
Yeah, no, it definitely is very sort of like, intense setup here, because like you said, like our characters are willing, or our Red Lotus characters are willing to take people like completely out of the picture here. And for a time here, like you said, there it does look like Kaya's doing pretty well here, but I think it's just a difference in our characters and sort of what they're focused on. Like the Red Lotus here, they're all about sort of like forcing the combat and sort of taking it sort of like 1-on-1 or as a group, against other opponents here versus, you know, Boomy, he's a general or was a general, but he's not really, someone who's going to be directly in the fight. And Kaya's focused on other things. So Tenzin out of this group would have the best chance in terms of battle here. So it's just unfortunate that the odds are really sort of against him in this situation here. And even Kai sort of willing to do what he can to sort of support people here is also sort of like at a huge sort of disadvantage here, despite sort of him being a pretty good sort of like, initial sort of beginning sort of airbender here. So yeah, it's just sort of a unfortunate setup here with who they're actually going against.
So we cut back to Tenzin. It looks like he's about to finally land a decisive blow against Zahir, maybe win his fight, when the others interfere. So Tenzin is put in a situation where he has to stand his ground 3-on-1, but he still does so for a little bit. It looks like he's not completely like outmatched straight up 3-on-1, but the second it becomes 4-on-1 with Pali able to focus on Tenzin, he's out of the fight basically. He's not going to give up. He's willing to kind of die here to waste as much time as possible and let as many people as possible escape. As we see him basically just get like kind of beaten into submission as we kind of cut away, but it just looks like they're just planning to just completely injure him here. They're not immediately set out to kill him, but the idea here is that Tenzin gets pretty badly injured from being kind of more or less defenseless eventually against all the Red Lotus here. So huge moment from kind of Tenzin here, getting to show off just how talented he is, but also just the unwillingness to give up. It's a really, really powerful moment from Tenzin here. And then the episode does end on a moment of hope, which is that Kai is alive. He's hanging from a tree on the side of a cliff, and he is saved by one of the baby bison from original Airbenders. And this is who will be his bison going forward, Lefty. So cool moment to end the episode, but otherwise things are not going very well. But what are your thoughts on these final sequences?
Yeah, no, this is very sort of, traumatic sort of ending of the episode here. And I think, it's interesting to see this again because, people are always sort of mentioning the Tenzin versus Zervir fight and sort of the differences in how they use their M-branding and sort of the traditional sort of techniques that, Tenzin's able to use versus just sort of the more, I guess you could say, just more general martial arts that Zahir has from his sort of experience and stuff like that. So it's always something to compare and contrast those and to see who was at least initially winning out here between them before it sort of became one-sided when it's sort of a 3-on-1 here. So it's just unfortunate the situation that it wasn't more balanced between the whole sort of good guy group here overall, but it's definitely something to see, Tenzin work at sort of his full capacity here, despite sort of the odds against him. But yeah, I do like, that they at least give you some hope for things being better with Kai sort of surviving things, which I think, you could see that he did sort of the air blast to sort of protect himself. So, there was some hope that, he would sort of survive this, and I like that they're able to show that at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really kind of impactful episode. Like, yeah, it makes sense that this is the setup for our kind of finale, with the idea being that, okay, Korra is going to have to get more involved in things going forward, given how badly kind of things have gone, and there's still so many big moments in book 3 still to come. But yeah, we will get to that next time out. I believe the way I have it like ordered is that we do the 2 episodes of remaining episodes of book 3 of Korra and just 1 on the Avatar side next time. So we'll finish book 3 next podcast, hopefully. And that should be great. We're beginning to get towards the end of the rewatches, which is kind of cool. But otherwise, yes, that has been episode 305 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye.